At dinner, my son said loudly, "You are a loser, but my mom's new husband is not." I didn't say anything. A week later, he was without a car money and a roof over his head. And in the evening, my ex called me in a panic. "My name is Joseph. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 years building a logistics empire from the ground up, wearing steel-toed boots and grease-stained shirts as a proud African-American man making his way in a brutal industry. Let me tell you what happens when the son you raised decides your humility is a weakness." Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned, not bought. The crystal chandelier of Le Petit Chateau cast a harsh light on my frayed brown corduroy suit. I had been sitting at the reserved table for 45 minutes when my son Tyson finally walked in. He wore a tailored navy suit that cost more than my first delivery truck. His white wife Megan walked right behind him, draped in silk and dripping with diamonds. They did not apologize for their extreme tardiness. Megan immediately scoffed as she took her seat. She announced loudly that she almost tripped over a hideous rusted pickup truck parked out front by the valet. She asked if the restaurant was letting the trash collectors park out front now. I looked directly at her and stated the truck was mine. Megan offered a fake, unapologetic smile and ordered a martini. Tyson did not defend me. Instead, he leaned across the white linen tablecloth and shook his head. He told me I embarrassed him. He stated that I had wasted my entire life rotting inside dirty warehouses for pennies. He raised his voice, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear every word. He pointed his finger at my chest and called me a complete loser. He then compared me to Conrad, my ex-wife Valerie's wealthy new husband. Tyson proclaimed that Conrad was a real man of high society, a titan of investment who actually knew how to provide a life of luxury. I listened to my own flesh and blood degrade 40 years of my silent sacrifice. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my choices. I simply watched the arrogance consume the boy I had raised. The waiter arrived carrying a silver tray with the bill for the appetizers and the vintage wine Tyson had ordered before even greeting me. Tyson snatched the leather folder and casually dropped a heavy black corporate credit card onto the receipt. He smirked and boasted that the bottle of Bordeaux cost $2,000. He claimed his executive position at Apex Logistics covered all his luxury expenses. He told me I could never understand that kind of corporate power. I stared at the black plastic card resting on the table. My son believed he was a self-made executive riding the wave of elite corporate success. He did not know the truth. He did not know that Apex Logistics was merely a minor subsidiary of a massive supply chain empire. He had no idea that the parent company belonged entirely to me. I had secretly purchased the firm 5 years ago and orchestrated his hiring through a proxy board of directors. I wanted to give him a secure job without handing him unearned wealth. I wanted him to learn the value of hard work from the inside. Instead, he used his title as a license for gluttony and arrogance. He believed Conrad's flashy, empty world was the peak of success. The disrespect burned deep in my chest, but my face remained an impassive mask. I let the silence stretch between us. I did not shout. I did not throw my drink in his face. True power does not require a grand performance. I looked at his smug expression and realized the boy I loved was entirely gone. He had mutated into a parasite. The time for quiet observation was officially over. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. I reached inside the inner pocket of my worn jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. I opened it and counted out 20 crisp $100 bills. I placed the stack of cash directly on top of his corporate credit card. I added 5 more $100 bills specifically for the waiter. I did not say a single word. I simply adjusted my collar and looked at Tyson one final time. I saw a brief flash of confusion cross his face, quickly replaced by a sneer of pure superiority. He laughed loudly, a sharp, grating sound that echoed through the quiet dining room. He asked if I had just emptied my entire miserable retirement account to look like a big shot for one night. Megan covered her mouth, giggling at the thought of my supposed financial ruin. Tyson pushed the cash aside and declared that a real man uses corporate backing, not dirty paper money stored under a mattress. He told me to take my pitiful life savings and drive my junk truck back to the ghetto. I did not offer any rebuttal. I did not justify my wealth or correct his fatal assumption. I turned my back on them and walked steadily toward the exit. The heavy glass doors closed behind me, cutting off the sound of their cruel laughter. The cool night air hit my face, bringing a sudden, absolute clarity. I had spent decades trying to protect my son from the harsh realities of the world. My protection had only bred entitlement. Now I was going to give him the greatest lesson of his life. I walked up to my rusted truck. It was the first vehicle I ever bought with honest dock-working money, and it ran perfectly. I climbed into the worn driver's seat and shut the heavy metal door. The silence of the cabin enveloped me. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I kept on speed dial. Attorney Hayes answered on the second ring with his usual crisp professionalism. I did not waste time with greetings. I gave a single, unwavering directive. I ordered him to instantly freeze every corporate account associated with Tyson's division at Apex Logistics. I instructed him to terminate Tyson's executive status effectively immediately and initiate the immediate repossession of all company assets assigned to him. Hayes asked no questions. He simply confirmed the orders would be executed before morning. I hung up the phone and started the engine. The old engine roared to life with a steady, dependable rumble. Tyson wanted to worship the illusion of wealth provided by his mother's new husband. He wanted to spit on the man who had secretly funded his entire existence. He was about to wake up to a world where his corporate armor was completely stripped away. I pulled out of the restaurant parking lot and drove into the dark city streets. I felt no regret. I felt no sorrow. The silent adjustment had begun, and Tyson had absolutely no idea the storm that was coming for him at dawn. I authorized the repossession at exactly 6 o'clock on Monday morning. I sat at my massive oak desk in the downtown headquarters, watching the GPS signal of the tow truck approach Tyson's manicured suburban cul-de-sac. Tyson always valued his sleep. He believed real executives did not need to rise before the sun. The neighborhood was perfectly silent until the harsh, rumbling diesel engine of a heavy-duty flatbed truck shattered the morning peace. The flashing yellow lights of the tow truck reflected off the pristine white columns of the house my money had indirectly paid for. Tyson woke up to the grinding sound of hydraulic gears. He did not take the time to put on his tailored suits. He burst through his mahogany front door wearing only a silk bathrobe and leather slippers. He sprinted down the paved driveway, waving his arms frantically. The tow truck operator had already secured the heavy steel hooks to the axles of the matte black luxury SUV. Tyson loved that vehicle. He drove it around the city as a symbol of his supreme corporate status, oblivious to the fact that the registration was filed under a fleet management account I directly controlled. The hydraulic winch whined loudly, lifting the rear tires of the $100,000 machine off the immaculate driveway. Tyson stood barefoot on the cold concrete, his breath forming white clouds in the crisp morning air. He ordered the driver to stop immediately. He pounded his fists against the side of the flatbed. He demanded respect, assuming his loud voice would bend the working-class man to his will. He was dead wrong. The operator did not flinch. He simply locked the winch and stepped down from the cab holding a thick clipboard. The silent adjustment had officially arrived at Tyson's front door. Tyson screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding the operator release his vehicle. He reached into his bathrobe pocket and pulled out his sleek embossed business card. He shoved the card into the operator's chest loudly, declaring himself the Vice President of Regional Acquisitions for Apex Logistics. He threatened to bury the towing company in endless lawsuits. He promised to personally ruin the operator's life for trespassing on elite property. The tow truck driver remained completely unbothered by the tantrum. He looked at the business card, looked back at Tyson, and let the small piece of cardstock fall to the ground. The driver calmly opened his clipboard and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper. He handed the document directly to my son. Tyson snatched the paper, fully expecting to see a standard repossession notice caused by a simple banking error. Instead, his eyes scanned the bold black text printed on official corporate letterhead. The document clearly stated that the luxury SUV was the exclusive property of Apex Logistics. It detailed a direct executive order revoking all assigned fleet vehicles. The second paragraph contained a much harsher reality. It formally notified Tyson that his executive privileges, including all access to company assets, funds, and properties, were terminated effective immediately. The signature at the bottom belonged to Attorney Hayes. Tyson stared at the signature, the color completely draining from his face. His grand illusion of corporate invincibility shattered right there on his paved driveway. He tried to process the words, refusing to believe his unearned empire could be dismantled by a single piece of paper. He told the driver there was a massive misunderstanding, completely unaware that his entire life up to this point was the actual misunderstanding. The front door swung open again. Megan marched down the driveway, clutching her silk robe tightly around her waist. She glared at the tow truck with absolute disgust before turning her fury entirely on Tyson. She pointed at the neighboring houses, noting that several curtains were already twitching. She demanded Tyson fix the humiliating spectacle, immediately warning him that the neighbors were watching them like common criminals. Tyson swallowed hard, desperate to maintain his illusion of control in front of his demanding wife. He reached back into his pocket and pulled out his prized possession. He held up his heavy metal corporate credit card, the same black card he had slammed on the restaurant table just days prior. He confidently ordered the driver to run the card and charge whatever penalty fee was required to unhook the vehicle. The driver pulled a wireless payment terminal from his belt and swiped the heavy metal card. The machine beeped a sharp negative tone. The screen flashed bright red with a single word. Declined. Tyson froze. He snatched the terminal, insisting the machine was broken. He aggressively swiped the card a second time. The machine beeped again. Declined. Megan crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently on the cold concrete. Tyson's hands began to shake. He pulled his personal leather wallet from his robe pocket and removed a platinum bank card. He swiped it. Declined. He tried a gold rewards card. Declined. He tried a basic debit card. Declined. Every single financial lifeline tied to his name had been surgically severed in the middle of the night. He stood in the freezing dawn holding 5 useless pieces of plastic, completely unable to buy his way out of the consequences. Pure panic finally washed over Tyson. The financial paralysis paralyzed his vocal cords. He stared at his empty hands as the tow truck driver climbed back into the cab. The diesel engine roared loudly, and the truck pulled away, dragging Tyson's symbol of status down the street and out of sight. Megan screamed in his face, demanding an explanation for the declined cards. She accused him of hiding massive debts and jeopardizing her pristine suburban reputation. Tyson could not formulate a coherent sentence. His mind raced through a dozen impossible scenarios, entirely missing the singular truth connecting them all. He convinced himself that a rogue accountant or a massive banking glitch had temporarily frozen the corporate accounts. He needed to get to the Apex Logistics headquarters immediately to assert his dominance and fire whoever was responsible for the error. He grabbed Megan's phone from her hands and opened a rideshare application. He was forced to link her personal credit card to the account just to order a cheap sedan to his driveway. He ignored her relentless yelling, rushing back inside the house to throw on his most expensive tailored suit. He believed dressing the part of a wealthy executive would automatically restore his power. He jumped into the back seat of the arriving rideshare vehicle, barking orders at the confused driver to speed toward the downtown financial district. He adjusted his silk tie, fully preparing to storm the corporate offices and demand total submission from his subordinates. He stared out the window, consumed by his own arrogance, entirely oblivious to the reality waiting for him. He was speeding directly toward a calculated ambush, rushing blindly into the iron jaws of a trap I had set with absolute precision. I watched the high-definition security footage from the comfort of my downtown office, observing every agonizing second of my son's arrival at the Apex Logistics headquarters. Tyson burst through the revolving glass doors of the towering skyscraper with the manufactured urgency of a man who believed he owned the building. He had adjusted his imported silk tie in the reflection of the glass, projecting an aura of absolute authority. He marched across the polished marble floor toward the secure executive elevators, completely ignoring the front desk staff he usually terrorized. He slapped his keycard against the biometric scanner at the security turnstiles. The machine emitted a harsh, flat, negative tone. A bright red light flashed across the digital display. Tyson scowled and slammed the plastic card against the reader a second time. The result remained identical. He slapped the machine with his open palm, shouting at the receptionist to manually override the system. Before he could unleash a full tirade, 2 massive security guards stepped directly into his path. They were men who worked for a living, men with calloused hands and iron postures, the exact type of men Tyson openly despised. They did not address him as a vice president. They did not offer a polite greeting. The lead guard placed a heavy hand squarely on Tyson's chest, physically halting his forward momentum. He informed Tyson that his access credentials had been permanently revoked. Tyson demanded they step aside, his voice echoing loudly across the cavernous lobby. He threatened to have both men fired and blacklisted from the industry before the morning was over. The guards remained perfectly still, like statues carved from granite, treating my son not as a powerful executive, but as a hostile trespasser violating private property. The soft chime of the private executive elevator echoed through the tense lobby. The polished steel door slid open to reveal my attorney, Mr. Hayes. Hayes walked across the marble floor with methodical precision. He did not carry a leather briefcase or a stack of legal briefs. He carried a cheap, dented cardboard box. Inside that box sat the pathetic remnants of Tyson's fabricated corporate life, including a crystal paperweight and a framed photograph of his arrogant wife. Hayes stopped inches away from Tyson and shoved the cardboard box directly into his chest. Tyson staggered backward instinctively, grabbing the box to keep it from hitting the floor. Hayes calmly informed him that his employment with Apex Logistics was officially terminated. He handed Tyson a single sheet of paper outlining the immediate cessation of his salary, his bonuses, and his severance packages. Tyson sneered at the document, refusing to accept the reality of his situation. He threw the termination letter onto the marble floor and unleashed a furious barrage of threats. He proudly declared that he was going to call Conrad to intervene. He promised that his mother's wealthy husband would buy out the entire logistics firm by the end of the week. He swore he would personally oversee the liquidation of Hayes's law firm and ensure every executive involved in this termination was left begging for scraps on the street. Tyson leaned in close, his face red with unearned confidence, shouting that Conrad's financial empire could crush a mediocre shipping company with a single phone call. Hayes did not blink. He did not flinch at the mention of Conrad's name. He simply reached into his tailored jacket and produced a black leather binder containing the absolute truth. Hayes opened the leather binder and held it out for Tyson to read. It was the master corporate ownership ledger for the entire logistics network, a document fiercely guarded by layers of ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Hayes instructed Tyson to look at the name of the majority shareholder holding 95% of the voting rights. Tyson scoffed, glancing down at the paper with an expression of pure condescension. His eyes tracked across the heavily redacted financial lines until they hit the bold ink at the bottom of the page. The color instantly drained from his face. His breathing stopped. The name printed in undeniable black ink was mine. Joseph. Tyson stared at the letters, his mind violently rejecting the information. He reread the paragraph detailing the total acquisition of Apex Logistics 5 years prior, executed quietly through a proxy board of directors. The crushing realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. The father he had publicly humiliated the night before, the man he had repeatedly called a miserable loser, was the architect of his entire reality. I was the phantom king of the glass tower. Every expensive dinner he ate, every luxury car he drove, every ounce of power he wielded had been directly funded by the grease-stained hands he despised. His entire identity as a self-made corporate titan evaporated in a fraction of a second. He realized he was nothing more than a highly paid intern playing a rigged game designed entirely by his father. The corduroy suit he had mocked covered a man who could financially eradicate him with a single whisper. Tyson's jaw trembled as he looked up at Hayes, desperately searching for a lie in the lawyer's eyes, but he found only cold, absolute certainty. Hayes gave a sharp, subtle nod to the security team. The two burly guards instantly moved in, grabbing Tyson by his expensive suit jacket. Tyson tried to resist stammering my name in a pathetic whisper, but his legs failed him. The guards practically carried him across the slick marble floor toward the exit. They shoved him roughly through the revolving doors, sending him stumbling onto the harsh concrete pavement outside. The cardboard box tumbled from his grasp. His crystal paperweight shattered into a dozen pieces against the curb. The framed photo of Megan cracked the glass, splintering over the sidewalk. The security guards locked the heavy glass doors from the inside, sealing my son out in the cold morning air. Tyson scrambled on his hands and knees, desperately gathering his scattered belongings. The manicured illusion of his life was officially destroyed. Driven by absolute panic, he pulled his phone from his pocket. He needed a lifeline. He needed the phantom wealth he had weaponized against me just hours ago. He bypassed my number entirely and frantically dialed Conrad's private cellular line, praying the wealthy investor could somehow reverse this nightmare. He held the phone tightly against his ear, his breathing ragged and desperate. The line did not ring. A sharp mechanical click echoed through the speaker. A pre-recorded automated voice delivered a message that finalized his total isolation. The cold robotic voice stated that the number he had dialed was no longer in service. Tyson stared at the glowing screen of his phone as the icy wind cut through his expensive suit. He was completely broke, completely alone, and entirely unaware that his mother was currently experiencing a parallel destruction. My private security team tracked Tyson's exact movements after my guards ejected him from the corporate lobby. The sky opened up, pouring freezing rain over the downtown financial district. Tyson could not afford a taxi, his corporate phone was deactivated, and his personal bank cards were completely dead. He was forced to walk 3 miles back to his upscale suburban neighborhood carrying a damp, flimsy cardboard box. The expensive Italian leather of his designer shoes cracked and soaked through with dirty puddle water. He arrived at his manicured doorstep completely shivering, physically exhausted, and thoroughly defeated. He pushed the heavy front door open, leaving muddy footprints across the pristine white Persian rug in the foyer. Megan stood in the center of the vaulted living room holding a glass of sparkling water. She took one disgusted look at his ruined suit and demanded a swift explanation for the humiliating spectacle with the tow truck earlier that morning. Tyson dropped his wet cardboard box onto the expensive glass coffee table. His voice broke as he confessed the absolute reality of his situation. He admitted that his executive position was terminated, his accounts were frozen, and his entire career was a fabricated illusion. Megan demanded to know who possessed the authority to fire him from his own division. Tyson looked his furious wife in the eye and revealed the crushing truth. He told her that his loser father, the man they had publicly humiliated the night before in the restaurant, was the sole owner of Apex Logistics. He admitted that my blue-collar hands held the master keys to the entire corporate empire they had been leeching off of. Megan did not offer a warm embrace or a single word of comfort. She did not express an ounce of sympathy for her husband's profound public humiliation. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She hurled her crystal glass against the hardwood floor, shattering it into jagged fragments. She screamed that she did not marry a penniless fraud just to end up standing in a puddle of dirty rainwater. She berated him relentlessly for jeopardizing her country club memberships and destroying her elite social standing. Tyson tried to calm her down, offering empty promises that he would leverage his industry contacts to secure a new executive role by the end of the week. Megan laughed bitterly in his face. She reminded him that his so-called industry contacts only answered his calls because of the massive corporate backing he had just lost. She stepped closer, pointing a sharp finger directly at his chest, declaring that their massive balloon mortgage payment was due in less than 3 days. Without my corporate slush fund, they were completely insolvent and drowning in debt. She ordered Tyson to pick up his phone and call his mother Valerie immediately. She demanded that Valerie force Conrad to cover the mortgage payment out of his vast investment portfolio. Megan insisted that Conrad owed them a massive bailout, considering Tyson had routinely and illegally funneled my subsidiary's capital into Conrad's real estate ventures. Tyson hesitated, his fragile pride already fractured, but Megan delivered a terrifying ultimatum. She promised to pack her bags and file for divorce before dinner if he did not make the call. Tyson pulled out his personal phone and dialed his mother's number with trembling, cold fingers. He placed the call on speaker so Megan could hear the incoming financial rescue. The line rang multiple times before Valerie finally answered the call. She did not greet her son with her usual arrogant, high society tone. She was hyperventilating, choking on violent, uncontrollable sobs that echoed through the quiet living room. Tyson interrupted her crying, asking her to put Conrad on the line to authorize an emergency wire transfer to save his house. Valerie let out a hysterical wail that chilled the blood in Tyson's veins. She confessed that Conrad was completely gone. She frantically whispered that federal agents in tactical gear were currently tearing her multi-million-dollar mansion apart. They were seizing her diamond jewelry, confiscating her fleet of luxury vehicles, and boxing up every single financial record in the estate. The horrific truth spilled from her trembling lips in a rapid, chaotic confession. Conrad was never a legitimate titan of investment. His exclusive hedge fund was nothing but a massive, incredibly destructive Ponzi scheme. The sudden freeze I placed on the Apex Logistics accounts that morning had instantly choked off the illicit capital Tyson was illegally transferring to Conrad. Without my money to artificially inflate the books, the fraudulent empire imploded in a matter of hours. Conrad had emptied their hidden offshore accounts and fled the state, leaving Valerie completely abandoned to face the severe wrath of the FBI alone. She begged Tyson to send a defense lawyer to the mansion immediately. Tyson stood frozen in his living room, listening to his mother's frantic pleas through the phone speaker. The realization that his ultimate safety net was completely obliterated paralyzed his vocal cords. He slowly disconnected the call without offering his mother any help, leaving Megan staring at him in absolute wide-eyed horror. Before either of them could speak a single word, 3 sharp, authoritative knocks hammered against their solid mahogany front door. Tyson stumbled forward and pulled the heavy door open. A man in a plain gray suit stood on the porch holding a thick manila envelope. The man did not introduce himself or ask for an invitation inside. He simply shoved the heavy envelope into Tyson's chest and stated clearly that he had been legally served. Tyson ripped the envelope open, his hands shaking violently as he pulled out the official court documents. It was an expedited notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction. The legal text clearly outlined a truth Tyson had purposefully chosen to ignore for the last 3 years. He did not own the suburban mansion. The deed was securely held by a private real estate trust I had established long before he ever moved in. The grace period for the missed balloon payment had officially expired at noon today. The final paragraph of the legal document delivered the ultimate devastating blow to his ego. They had exactly 48 hours to pack their personal belongings and vacate the premises entirely. If they failed to comply, armed sheriff deputies would arrive to physically remove them from my property. Tyson sped his wife's leased sports car up the muddy, winding road toward the dense pine forest. The pouring rain turned the dirt path into a treacherous slide, but his absolute desperation fueled his reckless driving. He almost lost control of the vehicle twice, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel with white knuckles. He slammed the brakes, skidding to a halt mere inches from the wooden steps of my secluded cabin. He did not bother to turn off the engine or grab an umbrella. He leaped from the driver's seat, his ruined tailored suit clinging to his shivering frame. Megan followed closely behind her high heels, sinking deep into the cold mud. Tyson marched up the wooden steps with a completely unearned sense of authority. He did not knock. He raised his muddy leather shoe and kicked the heavy oak door inward with all his remaining strength. The door slammed violently against the interior wall. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still in my worn leather armchair beside the roaring stone fireplace. I watched my son march into my home, dragging a trail of dirty rainwater across the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. He screamed that my pathetic little prank was officially over. He demanded I immediately pick up my phone and reverse the foreclosure on his suburban house. He ordered me to reinstate his executive position at Apex Logistics with a massive apology bonus for the emotional distress I had caused his wife. Megan stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, shivering in her soaked silk robe, demanding I write them a blank check to cover the severe damage to their reputation. They stood in my modest sanctuary, completely stripped of their corporate armor, yet still demanding total obedience from the man they believed was beneath them. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The crackling fire provided the only response to their furious demands. I reached down to the rustic wooden coffee table and picked up a heavy black binder. I tossed it across the smooth surface. The thick binder landed heavily directly at Tyson's muddy feet. I told him his executive position was never a birthright, but a strict test of his integrity. I stated clearly that he had failed the test spectacularly. Tyson stared at the binder, his arrogant demands faltering. I instructed him to open the cover and read the forensic accounting reports compiled by my elite audit team. He slowly bent down and opened the thick file. His eyes scanned the highlighted spreadsheets and bank transfer logs. I explained the contents aloud so his wife could hear every single detail. The documents contained absolute, undeniable proof that Tyson had systematically embezzled $500,000 from the Apex Logistics operational accounts over the past 18 months. I detailed how he had created fake vendor invoices to siphon the capital directly into offshore accounts controlled by Conrad. He believed he was secretly building a massive personal fortune by investing stolen company money into his mother's husband's fraudulent Ponzi scheme. He assumed my subsidiary was too large and too bureaucratic to notice the missing funds bleeding from the logistics division. He never realized I personally reviewed every quarterly audit with ruthless scrutiny. I watched the blood drain from his face as he stared at the meticulous documentation of his federal crimes. His hands shook so violently that the pages rattled against the heavy metal binder rings. He tried to formulate a cowardly excuse, stammering that the money was just a temporary corporate loan he intended to fully repay. I cut him off instantly. I told him a thief does not dictate the terms of his surrender. Megan snatched the heavy binder directly out of Tyson's trembling hands. Her eyes frantically scanned the highlighted offshore account numbers and the devastating summary of the depleted funds. Her expression morphed from wet, shivering misery into sheer calculating horror. The documents proved that every single stolen dollar had evaporated inside Conrad's collapsed criminal empire. She slammed the binder onto the solid oak coffee table with a resounding crack. She rounded on Tyson, her voice echoing harshly off the timber walls. She screamed that he had specifically promised that $500,000 was strictly earmarked for her new luxury lifestyle brand. She had already signed an expensive lease on a high-end commercial storefront in the city, relying entirely on the capital he swore he possessed. She realized instantly that the business venture, the suburban mansion, and her elite country club status were permanently gone. The stolen money was completely unrecoverable, and she was permanently shackled to a penniless criminal. She did not offer her husband support or loyalty in his darkest moment. She looked at him with absolute unfiltered disgust. She repeated the exact words he had used against me at the French restaurant just a week prior. She called him a complete loser. She told him he was a pathetic, empty fraud who had wasted his life pretending to be a titan of industry. Tyson reached out to touch her arm, begging her to stay calm and promising he would find a new scheme to rebuild their wealth. She slapped his hand away as if his skin were coated in poison. She backed away toward the open door, realizing her only chance at survival was severing herself entirely from the sinking ship of his life. I stood up from my leather armchair, towering over my broken son. I ordered both of them to immediately vacate my property. I stated with cold, absolute authority that my cabin was a sanctuary for honest workers, not a refuge for corporate thieves. Tyson fell to his knees on the muddy floorboards, completely abandoning his executive pride. He begged me to protect him from the federal authorities investigating Conrad's collapsed scheme. He pleaded for me to use my massive wealth to buy him a high-powered defense attorney and sweep the massive embezzlement under the rug. I looked down at him without a single ounce of pity. I informed him that I do not finance criminals under any circumstances. I calmly revealed that a duplicate copy of the black binder was already sitting on the desk of the local district attorney. I had instructed Attorney Hayes to hand-deliver the forensic evidence to the police exactly 1 hour ago. The color vanished entirely from Tyson's eyes. The faint, piercing wail of police sirens drifted through the open cabin door, cutting through the heavy rain. The sound grew steadily louder, echoing up the winding mountain road. Megan did not waste a single second. She turned on her heels and sprinted down the wooden steps, ignoring the mud splashing against her bare legs. She jumped into the driver's seat of her leased sports car and slammed the doors, locked. Tyson scrambled to his feet, shouting her name, rushing out onto the porch. Megan threw the car into reverse, spinning the tires in the deep mud. She violently shifted into drive and sped down the treacherous path, leaving Tyson stranded in the freezing rain to face the approaching sirens completely alone. The heavy oak doors of Valerie's sprawling estate stood wide open, welcoming a swarm of federal agents instead of high society guests. Rain lashed against the marble columns as men in dark windbreakers marched through the grand foyer. They carried dozens of heavy cardboard boxes filled with hastily shredded financial documents retrieved from Conrad's private study. Valerie stood frozen near the grand staircase, her silk dressing gown clutched tightly around her trembling frame. She watched in absolute horror as two agents carefully removed a priceless original oil painting from the dining room wall. The painting was a gift from Conrad, a symbol of their untouchable wealth now wrapped in protective plastic and logged as evidence of massive wire fraud. She stepped forward and demanded they stop screaming that the art belonged to her personal collection and was completely exempt from any corporate seizure. The lead agent did not pause his meticulous cataloging. He handed her a federal warrant authorizing the immediate confiscation of all assets purchased with illicit funds. He stated clearly that every piece of furniture, every diamond necklace, and every inch of the estate was currently under strict federal jurisdiction. Valerie tried to grab her diamond-encrusted phone from the entryway table to call her elite legal team. A female agent stepped directly into her path, placing a firm hand over the device. The agent informed Valerie that all electronic devices were officially classified as material evidence in an ongoing criminal conspiracy. The towering mansion, once a fortress of arrogance and stolen luxury, had transformed into a sterile crime scene in less than 2 hours. Valerie looked around her pristine living room, realizing her perfect insulated world was being dismantled piece by piece right before her eyes. The lead agent motioned for Valerie to sit on the velvet couch, pulling a thick file from his leather briefcase. He did not offer any sympathy or gentle explanations. He laid out the brutal, undeniable mechanics of her husband's fraudulent empire. He informed her that Conrad's elite investment firm never actually invested a single dime into the legitimate real estate market. The entire operation was a classic aggressive Ponzi scheme relying entirely on a constant influx of fresh capital to pay off early investors and fund their lavish lifestyle. Valerie shook her head wildly, insisting Conrad managed billions of dollars in elite client portfolios. The agent shattered that illusion instantly. He revealed that the sole lifeline keeping the massive fraud afloat for the past 18 months was a steady stream of embezzled corporate funds. He stated the stolen money was funneled directly through a compromised executive at Apex Logistics. Valerie felt the blood drain from her face as the agent spoke her son's name. Tyson had been illegally diverting $500,000 of corporate capital to prop up Conrad's lies. The agent explained the fatal blow that brought the entire structure crashing down. He noted that the true owner of Apex Logistics had abruptly frozen all subsidiary accounts and terminated Tyson's access earlier that morning. That sudden, absolute financial blockade instantly starved Conrad's scheme of its essential liquidity. Without Tyson's stolen money flowing in the fraudulent accounts collapsed simultaneously. The checks bounced, the investors panicked, and the federal watchdogs descended immediately. Valerie realized with crushing clarity that her ex-husband, the man she had discarded and despised for his blue-collar life, possessed the power to destroy her entire existence. Joseph had quietly cut the cord, and her empire of lies bled out instantly. Valerie pushed past the federal agents and sprinted frantically up the grand curved staircase. She ignored the stern warnings to remain seated, driven by a desperate need to find the man who had promised her endless security. She rushed into the master bedroom, calling out Conrad's name, expecting him to emerge from the bathroom with a brilliant legal strategy to fix the nightmare. The room was completely empty. The heavy mahogany closet doors were thrown wide open. Conrad's entire collection of tailored Italian suits and custom leather luggage was entirely gone. She ran into his private attached office, a space he fiercely guarded from everyone, including her. A massive steel wall safe sat behind a displaced oil painting, its heavy door hanging wide open. Valerie fell to her knees on the plush carpet, staring into the dark, hollow cavity of the safe. It was completely stripped bare. Stacks of emergency cash-bearer bonds and a collection of untraceable diamonds they kept for extreme emergencies had vanished. A single discarded burner phone and a shredded flight itinerary were the only items left behind on the floor. The absolute reality of the betrayal hit her with immense physical force. Conrad had known the collapse was imminent the exact moment Tyson's funds stopped arriving. He did not wake her to explain the crisis. He did not formulate a plan to protect his wife from the inevitable federal raid. He had silently packed his bags, emptied their emergency reserves, and fled the jurisdiction under the cover of darkness. He had deliberately left her behind in the sprawling mansion to serve as the perfect distraction for the authorities. Valerie sat on the floor, surrounded by federal agents, logging her ruined life, fully understanding she was meant to absorb the entirety of the criminal charges alone. Valerie snatched the discarded burner phone from the floor of the empty safe, her hands shaking violently. She punched in Tyson's personal number, praying her son possessed some hidden fraction of the stolen money to secure a high-powered defense attorney. The call connected after 5 agonizing rings. Tyson answered with a hollow, defeated whisper. He sat on the edge of a stained mattress inside a damp, windowless motel room on the absolute outskirts of the city. The harsh neon light from the parking lot flickered through the thin, dirty curtains. He stared blankly at the single crumpled $20 bill resting on the cheap laminate nightstand. It was the absolute sum total of his remaining wealth. Valerie did not ask how he was doing. She hysterically demanded he send a car and a lawyer to rescue her from the federal raid currently destroying her home. Tyson listened to his mother's frantic screaming, the sound completely devoid of its usual high society arrogance. He coldly informed her that his wife had abandoned him in the mud, his house was foreclosed, and his corporate accounts were permanently seized by the father they had both mocked. He told her there was no rescue coming from him or anyone else. The undeniable truth settled over the phone line, replacing the rising panic with a heavy, suffocating silence. Mother and son realized simultaneously that their entire identities had been constructed on a fragile foundation of stolen money and profound arrogance. They had actively mocked the very man who quietly sustained their grand illusions. Now those illusions were entirely eradicated. They possessed no leverage, no hidden assets, and absolutely no allies left to manipulate. Sirens wailed loudly in the background of both ends of the phone call. They sat in their respective ruins, completely paralyzed, waiting for the authorities to arrive and drag them away. Tyson woke up shivering on a stained mattress that smelled of stale smoke and cheap bleach. The rattling motel heater blew cold air instead of warmth into the cramped room. A sharp scratching sound drew his bloodshot eyes toward the base of the flimsy wooden door. A thick yellow envelope slid across the dirty linoleum floor. Tyson threw off the thin blanket and rushed to the door, tearing it open. He expected to find his wife standing in the freezing morning mist, ready to apologize and formulate a new plan together. He found an empty concrete walkway. He picked up the heavy envelope and tore through the adhesive seal. The thick stack of legal documents inside bore the letterhead of the most ruthless family law firm in the city. It was a fast-tracked divorce petition filed by Megan. She cited irreconcilable differences and profound financial negligence. Tyson scanned the aggressive demands with mounting horror. Megan demanded massive monthly alimony payments based entirely on his previous fabricated corporate salary. She requested immediate liquidation of all non-existent marital assets and full possession of the frozen bank accounts she still believed held residual wealth. She included a vicious addendum threatening to testify against him regarding his embezzlement if he contested the filing. Megan had completely severed the dead weight of their marriage to save herself without a shred of hesitation. Tyson let the papers slip from his trembling hands. The crisp white pages scattered across the filthy floor of the motel room. His wife had not just abandoned him in the mud at the cabin. She had legally weaponized his downfall to ensure he would never recover financially. His absolute isolation was officially documented in black and white. Desperation forced Tyson out into the freezing rain. He walked 2 agonizing miles to the nearest transit station and spent his last $20 on a train ticket to the affluent northern suburbs. He planned to leverage his extensive network of high society friends, men who had gladly drank his $2,000 wine and attended his lavish estate parties. He marched up the long, sweeping driveway of a sprawling contemporary mansion owned by his closest college fraternity brother, a wealthy hedge fund manager named Greg. Tyson rang the brass doorbell, shivering violently in his ruined, mud-stained suit. Greg opened the heavy door wearing a pristine cashmere sweater. He took one look at Tyson and physically recoiled. Greg did not offer a warm greeting or invite his freezing friend inside out of the storm. He held the door firmly shut, keeping a solid barrier between them. Greg stated with absolute coldness that federal agents had raided Valerie's estate at dawn. News of the massive Ponzi scheme and Tyson's direct involvement in laundering stolen corporate funds had already saturated their elite social circles. Greg declared that Tyson was legally and socially radioactive. He warned Tyson that any association with him would trigger a federal audit of his own pristine financial records. Tyson begged for a simple cash loan to secure a cheap defense attorney. Greg looked at him with profound disgust. He stated that true wealth requires intelligence, not just proximity to a fraudulent stepfather. Greg slammed the heavy door shut, engaging the deadbolt with a loud final click. Tyson stood alone on the pristine porch. He walked to 3 more houses in the neighborhood. Every single door remained locked. His powerful network had instantly evaporated, leaving him entirely exposed to the elements. The brutal rejections stripped away the last remaining shreds of Tyson's executive ego. He wandered the wet suburban streets, completely devoid of shelter, food, or allies. His mind frantically searched for a single remaining lifeline in the wreckage of his life. He remembered a drunken conversation with Conrad at a private country club gala 2 years ago. Conrad had bragged about a hidden, unregistered emergency safe bolted to the floor of his private downtown office. Conrad claimed the safe held a massive reserve of untraceable cash, foreign passports, and bearer bonds specifically designated for a catastrophic financial collapse. Tyson realized Conrad had likely emptied his home safe before fleeing the FBI raid, but he might have abandoned the secondary downtown reserve in his rush to escape the state. Tyson slipped onto a crowded commuter bus evading the fare inspector and rode silently back into the heart of the financial district. The towering glass structure housing Conrad's investment firm loomed against the dark, storm-filled sky. Tyson knew the building's security protocols intimately from his days delivering illicit corporate funds. He waited in the dark alleyway until the midnight security patrol completed their scheduled perimeter sweep. He slipped through an unsecured side entrance typically used by the overnight janitorial staff. He crept up the emergency stairwell, his wet shoes squeaking softly against the concrete steps. He reached the 30th floor and navigated the dark, silent corridors toward Conrad's corner suite. He produced a heavy steel paperweight he had scavenged from a receptionist's desk on a lower floor. He raised the heavy metal object and smashed the electronic lock panel beside Conrad's heavy oak door. He reached through the shattered plastic housing and manually tripped the internal locking mechanism. The heavy oak door swung open with a slow, ominous creak. Tyson slipped inside the pitch-black office and gently clicked the door shut behind him. His heart hammered violently against his ribs as he moved blindly toward the large mahogany desk. He dropped to his knees, feeling along the thick carpet for the hidden floor panel Conrad had described. His numb fingers brushed against the cold steel dial of the concealed safe. He let out a ragged breath of profound relief, believing he had finally secured his salvation and a ticket out of the city. A sharp, loud click instantly shattered the silence of the room. The blinding overhead fluorescent lights snapped on, flooding the office with harsh artificial daylight. Tyson flinched heavily, throwing his hands over his sensitive eyes. Two burly men in plain clothes stood firmly blocking the only exit. They wore heavy tactical vests bearing the bold yellow letters of the local police department. They were financial crimes detectives, and their weapons were already drawn and pointed directly at his chest. The lead detective ordered Tyson to place his hands flat on the floor and remain perfectly still. Tyson froze in sheer terror, realizing he had walked directly into a secured crime scene monitored by silent alarms. The detective stepped forward and yanked his arms roughly behind his back. The cold steel of heavy handcuffs snapped securely around his wrist, biting into his skin. The lead detective read him his Miranda rights in a bored, mechanical monotone. He formally placed Tyson under arrest for felony criminal trespassing, destruction of private property, and massive corporate embezzlement. The detectives hauled him aggressively to his feet. Tyson stared at the locked, impenetrable floor safe. His final desperate maneuver had cemented his total destruction. Tyson sat on a cold, bolted-down metal chair in the center of a windowless interrogation room. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a harsh, sickly pallor over his face. His expensive silk suit was wrinkled damp from the rain and smelled faintly of the mildew from the motel room. The steel door creaked open and Mr. Hayes stepped inside with the calm, predator-like precision of a man who held all the cards. Hayes sat opposite him, placing a thin black file on the metal table between them. He did not offer a greeting. Instead, he opened the file to a page filled with dense legal statutes. Hayes spoke with a detached clinical tone that amplified the severity of the situation. He informed Tyson that the evidence gathered from the company servers and the financial records recovered from the office provided a closed-case scenario. He explained that the embezzlement charges, when coupled with the unauthorized wire transfers into the fraudulent Ponzi scheme, carried a mandatory sentencing guideline. Hayes looked Tyson in the eye and laid out the stark reality. He stated that Tyson was facing a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He described the harsh conditions of the facility and the reality of a life beyond those walls once the sentence concluded. Tyson tried to scoff, claiming he had friends in high places who would fix this, but his voice cracked. The weight of the room pressed down on him, stripping away the remaining pretenses of his former corporate life. Hayes leaned forward, his expression remaining neutral and professional. He explained that Joseph had authorized a specific path forward. Joseph was willing to decline pressing formal corporate charges against his son, provided specific conditions were met immediately. The deal was simple, total surrender. Hayes slid a legal document across the table. It required Tyson to sign over every remaining personal asset he held, including his luxury watches, the balance of his personal bank accounts, and any minor holdings he had accumulated. Furthermore, he was required to provide the FBI with full unredacted cooperation regarding Conrad's illegal operations and the specific flow of the laundered funds. Hayes explained that this was not a negotiation, but an ultimatum. If Tyson refused, the corporate legal team would ensure the federal prosecutors threw the book at him, seeking the maximum possible sentence for every count of embezzlement. He made it clear that Joseph was no longer interested in teaching lessons through corporate policy. This was about legal finality. Tyson stared at the document, his mind racing through the options. He looked at Hayes, searching for any sign of mercy, but found only the cold, impenetrable wall of corporate justice. He realized his father was no longer a man he could manipulate or intimidate. The leverage he once thought he possessed had been nothing but a smokescreen of his own making. Tyson reached for his pen, his movements sluggish and heavy. He paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the final signature line. He tried to argue that there must be a way to keep at least his personal savings, claiming he needed a start for his new life. Hayes simply snapped his briefcase shut, signaling that the window for discussion had officially closed. He stood up, adjusted his coat, and turned toward the door as if to signal the end of the meeting. The sound of the latch releasing sent a jolt of pure terror through Tyson. He knew that if Hayes walked out that door without a signed document, the next people to walk in would be the federal agents ready to transport him to a holding cell. He burst into tears, his composure finally shattering completely. He scrambled to grab the pen, his hands trembling so violently he could barely grip the barrel. He signed his name at the bottom of the surrender agreement, the ink blotting on the paper as he pressed down with desperate force. He signed every page of the asset forfeiture list, legally stripping himself of everything he owned. He pushed the documents toward Hayes, his chest heaving with deep, ragged sobs. He had surrendered his past, his status, and his future in a matter of seconds. Hayes took the documents, tucked them into his briefcase, and walked out of the room without glancing back. Tyson sat alone for several minutes as the echo of the heavy door slamming shut faded into silence. Eventually, a guard opened the door and gestured for him to leave. He walked out of the precinct into the biting chill of the winter afternoon. He was no longer a person of interest to the state, but he was a man with absolutely nothing. He reached into his pockets, expecting to find his keys, his wallet, or his phone. All he felt was the empty, cold lining of his suit jacket. He checked his other pockets, frantic and clumsy, but found nothing but a few loose threads. He had no phone to call for help, no car to drive, and no credit cards to book a room. He walked toward the main road, the gray sky above him threatening more freezing rain. The winter wind bit through the thin, expensive fabric of his suit, chilling him to the bone. He had no destination and no source of income. He was a ghost in the city that had once bowed to his name. The long, lonely road ahead stretched out into the gray horizon, and for the first time in his life, Tyson realized that the consequences of his actions were now the only reality he possessed. The relentless freezing rain pounded against the windshield of Megan's leased sports car as Tyson navigated the treacherous, mud-slicked mountain road. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel with desperate, white-knuckled intensity. The absolute reality of his impending homelessness fueled a reckless fury, pushing the vehicle to its limits up the steep incline toward Joseph's modest woodland cabin. He skidded violently to a halt, the expensive tires churning deep ruts into the wet earth just inches from the rustic wooden porch. Tyson did not bother to kill the engine. He threw open the driver's door and marched out into the freezing downpour, his ruined designer suit instantly clinging to his shivering frame. Megan followed closely behind him, her high heels sinking deeply into the cold mud, her face contorted into a mask of pure indignation. Tyson stormed up the wooden steps with a completely unearned sense of authority. He did not knock or announce his arrival. He raised his heavy leather shoe and kicked the solid oak front door inward with all his remaining strength. The heavy door slammed violently against the interior wall, shaking the timber frame of the cabin. Joseph sat perfectly still in his worn leather armchair beside the roaring stone fireplace, a steaming mug of black coffee resting quietly in his calloused hands. He did not flinch at the violent intrusion. Tyson stood in the doorway, dripping dirty rainwater across the pristine hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking finger directly at his father's face. He screamed that the pathetic corporate prank was officially over. He demanded Joseph immediately pick up his phone, reverse the suburban foreclosure, and fully reinstate his executive position with a massive apology bonus to compensate for the severe emotional distress inflicted upon his wife. Joseph took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee, letting the crackling fire provide the only immediate response to his son's frantic, arrogant demands. He carefully set the ceramic mug down on the rustic side table. He reached over and picked up a thick, heavy black binder resting beside his chair. Without a single word of greeting or anger, Joseph tossed the massive binder across the room. It landed heavily, sliding across the smooth surface of the oak coffee table and coming to a halt directly at Tyson's muddy feet. Joseph looked his son in the eye and stated with absolute clarity that his executive position was never a birthright, but a strict test of his character and integrity. He informed Tyson that he had failed the test completely. Joseph instructed his son to open the cover and read the forensic accounting records compiled by the elite corporate audit team. Tyson hesitated, his aggressive posture faltering slightly before slowly bending down to open the heavy file. His bloodshot eyes scanned the meticulously highlighted spreadsheets and the undeniable logs of unauthorized bank transfers. Joseph narrated the contents aloud so Megan could hear every single devastating detail. The documents contained absolute, irrefutable proof that Tyson had systematically embezzled $500,000 from the Apex Logistics operational accounts over the past 18 months. Joseph explained how Tyson had fabricated sophisticated vendor invoices to siphon the capital directly into hidden offshore accounts controlled by Conrad. Tyson had foolishly believed he was secretly building a massive personal fortune by investing stolen company money into Conrad's fraudulent Ponzi scheme. He had fundamentally underestimated his father, assuming the blue-collar owner of the massive subsidiary was too uneducated to notice the missing funds bleeding from the logistics division. Megan shoved Tyson aside and snatched the heavy black binder directly from his trembling hands. Her eyes frantically darted across the highlighted offshore account numbers and the devastating summary of the completely depleted funds. Her expression rapidly morphed from wet, shivering misery into sheer calculating horror. The forensic documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single stolen dollar had evaporated instantly inside Conrad's collapsed criminal empire. She slammed the binder down onto the solid oak coffee table with a resounding, violent crack. She rounded on Tyson, her voice echoing harshly off the timber walls of the modest cabin. She screamed that he had specifically and repeatedly promised that $500,000 was strictly earmarked to launch her new luxury lifestyle brand. She viciously reminded him that she had already signed an expensive, legally binding lease on a high-end commercial storefront in the financial district, relying entirely on the capital he swore he possessed. She realized in that exact moment that the lucrative business venture, the sprawling suburban mansion, and her elite country club status were permanently gone. The stolen money was completely unrecoverable, and she was permanently shackled to a penniless, exposed criminal. She did not offer her husband a single ounce of support or loyalty in his darkest moment of absolute ruin. She looked at him with unfiltered, pure disgust. She aggressively repeated the exact words he had arrogantly used against his father at the French restaurant just a week prior. She called him a complete loser. She told him he was a pathetic, empty fraud who had wasted his entire adult life pretending to be a titan of industry. Tyson reached out to touch her arm, but she violently slapped his hand away. Joseph stood up from his leather armchair, towering over the chaotic spectacle of their shattered marriage. He spoke with a cold, absolute authority that demanded immediate obedience. He ordered both of them to vacate his property without another word. He stated firmly that his quiet cabin was a sanctuary for honest, hard-working people, not a refuge for corporate thieves and their greedy accomplices. Tyson fell to his knees on the muddy floorboards, completely abandoning his fabricated executive pride. He begged his father to protect him from the federal authorities actively investigating Conrad's collapsed scheme. He pleaded for Joseph to use his massive corporate wealth to buy him a high-powered defense attorney and quietly sweep the massive embezzlement under the rug to avoid a public scandal. Joseph looked down at his broken son without a single ounce of pity or hesitation. He informed Tyson that he does not finance or protect criminals under any circumstances. He calmly revealed that a duplicate copy of the heavy black binder was already sitting securely on the desk of the local district attorney. Joseph stated that his corporate legal team had officially handed over the forensic evidence to the police exactly 1 hour ago. The color vanished entirely from Tyson's eyes. The faint, piercing wail of police sirens drifted through the open cabin door, cutting sharply through the heavy rain. The sound grew steadily louder, echoing rapidly up the winding mountain road. Megan did not waste a single second. She turned on her heels and sprinted down the wooden steps, ignoring the mud splashing against her bare legs. She jumped into the driver's seat of her leased sports car and sped down the treacherous path, abandoning Tyson in the dirt to face the approaching sirens completely alone. Tyson shoved open the heavy glass doors of a mid-tier logistics firm, desperately attempting to bluff his way into an entry-level supply chain management position. His bespoke suit was severely wrinkled, stained with dried mud, and reeked of cheap motel bleach, but his survival depended entirely on securing an immediate income. He approached the reception desk, attempting to project the commanding charisma of a seasoned executive. He filled out the digital application at the lobby kiosk, aggressively inflating his credentials and carefully omitting the recent corporate termination. A hiring manager stepped out of the elevator holding a tablet displaying Tyson's freshly submitted background check. The automated screening software had instantly highlighted an active high-priority federal indictment for wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement. The manager's polite smile vanished. He signaled the front desk, and 2 heavily armed security guards immediately flanked Tyson. Tyson tried to argue, raising his voice and claiming the federal flags were a massive administrative misunderstanding that his legal team was already resolving. The guards ignored his frantic excuses. They grabbed him by the biceps, lifting his expensive leather shoes off the polished marble floor, and physically dragged him toward the exit. They threw him violently out the revolving glass doors onto the freezing concrete pavement. The security chief stepped outside, warning Tyson that his photograph was actively circulating through every commercial security database in the financial district. Tyson dusted off his damp trousers, the crushing reality of his situation settling over him. His fabricated resume was utterly toxic. He could not secure a job sweeping warehouse floors, let alone managing corporate accounts. The elite business world he once manipulated had permanently and systematically exiled him, leaving him entirely, completely locked out of the workforce. 2 full days evaporated, and Tyson had not consumed a single calorie. He survived by drinking freezing water from rusted park fountains to numb the severe twisting cramps in his empty stomach. The rapid physical degradation stripped away the very last layers of his executive sanity. He wandered aimlessly through the affluent downtown district, his feet dragging heavily against the wet, unforgiving pavement. He eventually stopped outside the large, pristine bay windows of an exclusive French restaurant. It was the exact high-end establishment where he had publicly humiliated his father just a few weeks prior. He pressed his trembling, freezing hands against the thick glass pane. He watched a wealthy patron sitting in a plush velvet booth effortlessly slicing into a thick, rare filet mignon. The rich aroma of roasted garlic and seared meat slipped through the exterior ventilation exhaust, actively torturing his heightened senses. Tyson stared at the exact table where he once sat. He vividly remembered tossing a crisp $100 tip onto the pristine tablecloth, openly mocking his father's calloused hands and scuffed work boots. He had arrogantly declared that real power was defined exclusively by elite status and absolute financial dominance. Now his Italian leather shoes were permanently split at the seams and his toes were numb from the biting winter wind. The wealthy patrons inside noticed the filthy vagrant staring hungrily through the glass. A sharply dressed waiter approached the window, aggressively tapping the glass with a silver pen and gesturing for Tyson to leave the premises immediately. The psychological torment of his rapid, absolute downfall shattered his remaining pride entirely, forcing him to turn away from the warm glow of the life he used to own. Driven entirely by a primal, blinding hunger, Tyson stumbled away from the bay window and navigated blindly toward the dark, narrow alley behind the restaurant kitchens. He slipped past a stack of discarded wooden crates and approached a row of heavy metal commercial dumpsters. The sour, overwhelming stench of rotting food and stagnant water filled his lungs, but his starving body completely overrode his rising nausea. He lifted the heavy plastic lid, digging his bare, freezing hands deep into the cold, wet trash. His fingers closed around a discarded, half-eaten artisan baguette wrapped in grease-stained paper. He pulled it out, bringing it to his mouth, ready to take a desperate, ravenous bite. A harsh, gravelly voice echoed from the deep shadows near the loading dock. 2 large, weathered men stepped into the dim, flickering light of a broken street lamp. They wore thick, layered rags and heavy, steel-toed work boots. They were hardened street scavengers, and Tyson had just encroached on their firmly established territory. The taller man stepped forward, pulling a rusted metal pipe from his heavy canvas coat. He ordered Tyson to drop the bread and empty his pockets immediately. Tyson's deeply ingrained corporate arrogance flared up in a brief, incredibly foolish moment of defiance. He stood up straight, puffing out his chest, attempting to project the commanding authority of a logistics executive handling a subordinate. He ordered the men to back away, using the sharp, condescending tone he once reserved for his warehouse employees. The 2 men did not flinch or retreat. They looked at his ruined, mud-stained designer suit and laughed with cruel, unfiltered malice, realizing the man standing before them possessed absolutely no power in their world. The taller man stepped forward and swung a heavy, calloused fist directly into Tyson's jaw. The brutal impact snapped Tyson's head back, sending a bright shower of blood across the wet asphalt. The second man moved with ruthless efficiency, kicking Tyson sharply in the back of the knees. Tyson collapsed onto the unforgiving pavement, the stale bread slipping from his loose grasp and splashing into a puddle of dark grease. The 2 men descended upon him without a shred of mercy. They kicked him repeatedly in the ribs, stomach, and face. Tyson curled into a tight, trembling ball, coughing up blood and gasping frantically for air. His sophisticated corporate vocabulary vanished instantly, replaced entirely by pathetic, whimpering pleas for them to stop. The attackers aggressively rifled through his empty pockets, finding nothing but wet lint and a useless valet ticket. Disgusted by his absolute poverty, they grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined suit jacket and threw him violently into a massive pile of wet, rotting garbage. The men walked away, leaving him broken, bleeding, and sobbing in the gutter. Tyson slowly opened his swollen purple eyes. A sleek black luxury SUV idled silently at the end of the narrow alleyway, its headlights cutting through the freezing mist. The rear passenger window glided down smoothly. Joseph sat in the plush leather seat, bathed in the soft ambient glow of the streetlights. He watched his son bleed among the trash with a completely impassive, stone-cold expression. The driver turned his head quietly, asking Joseph if he should call the paramedics or intervene. Joseph did not hesitate. He stated clearly that the lesson had not yet concluded. He ordered the driver to proceed to the next meeting. The tinted window glided back up and the heavy SUV pulled away, leaving the fallen false king to rot in the squalor of his own making. Tyson limped into the austere wood-paneled courtroom, his jaw heavily bruised and his lower lip split from the brutal alleyway beating. His once immaculate suit was a wrinkled, foul-smelling disaster, but he had no other clothes to his name. He sat alone at the respondent's table, shivering under the harsh fluorescent lights, completely devoid of legal representation. Across the aisle, Megan sat perfectly composed in a tailored designer dress, flanked by a notorious high-priced divorce attorney known for financially devastating his opponents. The attorney wasted no time standing before the judge, launching into a predatory and aggressive opening statement. He painted a completely fabricated picture of Tyson as a hoarding millionaire deliberately hiding vast corporate assets to deprive his client of her rightful marital lifestyle. The lawyer demanded an exorbitant monthly alimony payment, immediate liquidation of the marital estate, and a massive lump sum to cover Megan's anticipated commercial lease penalties. He continuously referenced the massive Apex Logistics empire, arguing that Tyson was the heir apparent to a sprawling corporate dynasty and easily possessed the capital to fulfill every single financial demand. Megan watched the proceedings with a cold, triumphant smirk, fully expecting the judge to grant her access to the deep pockets of Tyson's family wealth. She leaned back in her leather chair, visually assessing Tyson's battered face with utter apathy, entirely focused on extracting her golden parachute. Tyson stared at the polished mahogany table, lacking the energy or the means to object to the relentless barrage of financial demands. He prepared to be saddled with a lifetime of debt he could never possibly repay, fully anticipating the legal system to deliver the final crushing blow to his shattered existence. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, interrupting the aggressive monologue of Megan's attorney. Attorney Hayes strode down the center aisle with absolute unhurried authority, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He approached the bench, presenting his credentials and formally announcing his presence as the legal representative for the Apex Logistics Corporate Trust. Hayes did not look at Tyson. He directed his cold, clinical focus entirely toward the presiding judge. He opened his briefcase and produced a stack of certified, heavily notarized financial documents, distributing copies to the bench and to Megan's visibly irritated lawyer. Hayes methodically dismantled the entire foundation of the plaintiff's ridiculous financial demands. He proved with absolute legal certainty that Tyson owned zero personal assets, possessed absolutely no income, and held zero equity within the corporate structure. He detailed the asset forfeiture agreement Tyson had signed in the police interrogation room, legally stripping him of his luxury watches, residual bank balances, and any minor holdings to satisfy his embezzlement restitution. Furthermore, Hayes presented the ironclad trust documents established by Joseph decades prior. He explained that the entire corporate wealth of Apex Logistics and its subsidiaries was perfectly insulated by a series of bulletproof legal shields designed specifically to prevent frivolous extraction. Tyson was never an owner, a shareholder, or a beneficiary with direct access. He was merely a salaried employee who had been terminated with extreme prejudice for criminal misconduct. Megan's attorney frantically flipped through the dense legal statutes, his face turning pale as he realized the supposed gold mine was entirely inaccessible. The documents confirmed the stark, devastating reality: Tyson was legally and functionally insolvent, possessing absolutely nothing that a divorce court could possibly divide, seize, or award to an opportunistic spouse. The judge meticulously reviewed the certified trust documents and the signed restitution agreements, his expression hardening as the sheer scale of Tyson's financial ruin became evident. He looked down from the bench, fixing Megan's attorney with a stern, reprimanding glare. The judge stated clearly that the court could not extract blood from a stone, nor could it legally pierce an ironclad corporate trust to satisfy the demands of an estranged spouse. With a swift and decisive strike of his gavel, the judge systematically denied every single one of Megan's exorbitant financial requests. He ruled that zero alimony would be awarded, citing Tyson's complete lack of income and his looming federal criminal liabilities. Furthermore, the judge addressed the issue of legal compensation, noting the aggressive and entirely unsubstantiated nature of the plaintiff's financial claims. He ordered Megan to bear the absolute burden of her own exorbitant legal fees. The final ruling hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Megan's triumphant smirk dissolved instantly, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. She turned toward her high-priced attorney, demanding he file an immediate appeal, but the lawyer simply snapped his briefcase shut coldly, reminding her that his retainer was now completely depleted and requiring immediate replenishment. Her calculated gold-digging strategy had spectacularly backfired, trapping her in a web of her own making. Instead of securing a luxurious funded independence, she was now legally severed from the family wealth, burdened by a massive commercial lease she could not afford, and facing a mountain of aggressive legal bills. She stared at the judge in absolute disbelief, fully realizing that she had tied her fate to a sinking ship and was now drowning in the very debt she had attempted to force upon her ruined husband. Tyson shuffled out of the courtroom, his battered body aching with every slow, deliberate step. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the stark, echoing hallway of the courthouse, hoping to slip away into the shadows. Megan stormed out immediately behind him, her high heels clicking violently against the polished marble floor. She cornered him near the elevators, completely abandoning her refined society persona to unleash a torrent of vicious, unfiltered verbal abuse. She screamed that he had ruined her entire life, intentionally misleading her with a pathetic illusion of power and influence. She berated his battered appearance, calling him a worthless, cowardly parasite who could not even successfully steal without getting caught by his own blue-collar father. She did not express a single moment of pity for his bruised face or his impending federal prison sentence. She aggressively blamed him for her insurmountable legal debts and the complete obliteration of her social standing. Tyson stood silently, absorbing the venomous onslaught without attempting to defend himself. He looked into the furious, hateful eyes of the woman he had married, searching for a trace of the affection they had supposedly shared. There was absolutely nothing but resentment and calculating fury. Megan delivered one final venomous insult, declaring she wished she had never met him, before turning on her heel and marching out of his life forever. Tyson remained standing, completely alone in the vast, empty corridor. The harsh echoes of her footsteps faded into a deafening silence. A profound, crushing realization washed over his fractured mind. The luxurious dinners, the grand estate, the beautiful wife, none of it was real. He finally understood that absolutely nobody in his entire life had ever loved him for who he truly was. The biting winter wind rapidly transformed the freezing rain into a blinding snowstorm. Tyson stumbled blindly down the darkening city streets, entirely consumed by the immediate and terrifying reality of his exposure. His bespoke Italian leather shoes, already cracked and ruined from the mud of the mountain road, offered absolutely no traction or warmth against the accumulating ice. The thin silk of his tailored suit jacket froze stiff, turning into an icy shell that drew the remaining body heat directly out of his shivering frame. He tried to seek refuge inside a 24-hour convenience store, but the overnight clerk took one look at his bloodied, bruised face and immediately locked the glass doors. Tyson pressed his back against a brick alley wall, trying to shield himself from the relentless driving wind. His teeth chattered so violently that he bit his own tongue, tasting fresh copper in his mouth. He watched the affluent city residents hurry past him in heavy wool coats, entirely blind to the ruined man freezing to death in their periphery. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of corporate arrogance, and now that fortress was gone, leaving him completely vulnerable to the raw, unforgiving elements. He wrapped his arms around his chest, his fingers numb and turning a dangerous shade of blue. The temperature continued to plummet as midnight approached. The severe, biting cold crept past his skin, settling deep into his bones. His mind became sluggish, the initial panic slowly giving way to a dangerous, heavy lethargy. He realized with absolute clarity that if he remained sitting against the freezing brick wall, his heart would simply stop beating before dawn. Survival demanded immediate, desperate movement. A primal, deeply buried instinct for survival violently overrode his fading corporate ego. Tyson forced his stiff, agonizing muscles to push him up from the freezing pavement. He turned his back on the glittering skyline of the financial district and began walking toward the city limits. His destination was the dense pine forest and the winding dirt road leading to his father's cabin. It was a punishing 10-mile trek through a relentless blizzard, a journey that would easily break a healthy man wearing proper winter gear. Tyson marched forward, dragging his feet through the rising snowdrifts. Every single step sent a sharp, stabbing jolt of pain radiating from his blistered, bleeding heels up to his battered spine. He abandoned the manicured sidewalks, navigating the treacherous shoulders of the dark highway to avoid the passing snowplows. The freezing wind whipped across his face, solidifying the blood from his alleyway beating into a frozen mask. With every agonizing mile, the remaining fragments of his false identity were violently stripped away. He was no longer the arrogant logistics executive who casually dismissed his father's blue-collar hands. He was a starving, freezing animal, clawing desperately for a single ounce of warmth. He fell to his knees twice in the snow, his physical strength entirely depleted. But the terrifying image of dying alone in the ditch forced him back to his feet. He used the glowing red taillights of distant cars as a beacon, keeping his eyes fixed entirely on the dark tree line looming ahead. The agonizing march became a brutal, sustained battle against his own broken pride, forcing him to accept that his father's modest, isolated sanctuary was his absolute last remaining lifeline on Earth. The treacherous mountain road was completely buried under a thick, undisturbed layer of fresh snow. Tyson dragged his frostbitten feet up the final, brutal incline. The digital clock on a passing billboard miles back had flashed 3 in the morning, but his concept of time had completely disintegrated into a blur of endless, freezing agony. He finally breached the clearing, spotting the faint orange glow of a fire flickering through the small window of the timber cabin. The mere sight of the warm light triggered a sudden, catastrophic collapse of his remaining adrenaline. Tyson stumbled forward, his frozen legs finally refusing to support his weight. He crashed heavily onto the snow-covered wooden steps of the porch. The impact drove the remaining breath from his lungs, leaving him gasping weakly against the icy planks. He tried to call out for his father, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the severe cold. Only a pathetic, raspy wheeze escaped his cracked lips. He dragged his upper body across the frozen wood, inching his way toward the heavy oak door. He reached up his hands, completely numb and covered in deep, bleeding fissures from the long march. He closed his right hand into a weak, trembling fist. He struck the solid wood once, then twice, leaving dark crimson smears of fresh blood against the grain. The physical exertion of the final knock drained the absolute last reserve of his energy. His vision tunneled the edges of the world, turning black. He collapsed entirely against the rough timber frame, his cheek resting on the freezing welcome mat, and surrendered completely to the suffocating darkness of unconsciousness. The heavy iron latch of the oak door clicked sharply, breaking the deadly silence of the winter storm. The door creaked inward, spilling a wide, warm beam of orange firelight across the snow-covered porch. Joseph stood perfectly still in the doorway, a towering silhouette against the roaring hearth inside. He wore a thick flannel shirt and worn denim jeans, his calloused hands resting calmly at his sides. He looked down at the motionless, snow-covered body of his son crumpled on the welcome mat. He noted the ruined bespoke suit, the split leather shoes, and the fresh blood staining the doorframe. Joseph did not gasp in horror or drop to his knees in a panic. He did not offer a warm, forgiving embrace or utter a single word of fatherly comfort. He recognized instantly that the arrogant corporate fraud had been entirely eradicated, leaving behind only the broken shell of a man who had finally hit rock bottom. Joseph stepped out into the freezing wind. He bent down, his massive, working-class hands gripping the collar of Tyson's frozen silk jacket. With a single effortless heave, he hoisted his unconscious son off the icy planks. Joseph dragged Tyson's limp body across the threshold, hauling him directly over the pristine hardwood floor without caring about the trail of melting snow and blood. He pulled the heavy oak door shut, throwing the deadbolt with a loud final snap, sealing out the storm. He dumped Tyson unceremoniously onto the braided rug in front of the roaring fire. The first brutal phase of Tyson's destruction was completely finished. The far more punishing reality of his absolute reconstruction was about to begin. Tyson dragged himself from the crushing depths of unconsciousness, his mind swimming through a dense fog of physical agony. The ambient heat of the roaring fireplace slowly thawed the ice clinging to his battered face. He opened his swollen purple eyes to find his ruined silk suit replaced by stiff, oversized flannel thermals. He was lying on a rigid canvas cot positioned near the stone hearth. Every single muscle in his body screamed in protest as he attempted to shift his weight. His ribs ached with a sharp, stabbing intensity from the brutal alleyway beating, and his frostbitten toes throbbed with a dull, sickening burn. He turned his head and saw Joseph sitting at a small, scarred wooden dining table across the room. His father was quietly cleaning the action of a hunting rifle under the harsh glare of a single pendant light, exuding an aura of absolute, immovable authority. Joseph did not look up when Tyson finally groaned. He simply set a greasy rag aside, picked up a dented metal thermos, and walked over to the cot. Joseph dropped a rough, scratchy cotton towel directly onto Tyson's chest. He then placed a chipped ceramic bowl on the wooden floorboards next to the cot. The bowl contained a meager portion of lukewarm, gelatinous canned soup. A cheap plastic spoon rested against the rim. Joseph stepped back, towering over the broken man he had sired. He ordered his son to clean the dried blood off his face and eat the food immediately. Tyson stared at the gelatinous broth, a stark and humiliating contrast to the perfectly seared filet mignon he had hungered for just a few hours prior. He reached out with shaking, heavily bandaged hands, grasping the ceramic bowl like a lifeline. He swallowed a spoonful of the cold soup, the bland taste anchoring him to the miserable reality of his complete destruction. The cold soup hit Tyson's empty stomach instantly, triggering a massive, overwhelming wave of raw emotion. The sheer magnitude of his total failure completely shattered the final lingering fragments of his corporate pride. He dropped the plastic spoon into the bowl and burst into pathetic, ragged sobs. He scrambled upward, ignoring the sharp pain in his fractured ribs, and desperately grabbed the hem of his father's flannel shirt. He wept openly, loudly, begging for absolute forgiveness. He frantically swore that he would change, promising to be a completely different man, a better son, and a fiercely loyal employee. He cried out that the crushing betrayal by his wife and the violent beating in the alley had fundamentally cured his arrogance. He pleaded for a second chance to rebuild the logistics empire by his father's side. Joseph did not offer a comforting hand or a sympathetic nod. He physically peeled Tyson's bleeding fingers off his shirt and shoved him back down onto the rigid canvas cot. Joseph glared at his weeping son with eyes devoid of any paternal warmth. He stated that tears were the currency of weak men entirely unwilling to face the consequences of their actions. Joseph leaned down, placing his face inches from Tyson's bruised jaw. He deliberately echoed the exact vicious insult Tyson had spat at him inside the luxury French restaurant just weeks ago. He called his son a pathetic, empty loser. Joseph firmly explained that empty promises and emotional breakdowns held absolutely zero value in this cabin. He demanded sweat blood and tangible action, permanently rejecting any further attempts at emotional manipulation. He ordered Tyson to stop crying instantly, making it explicitly clear that forgiveness was not a gift to be handed out, but a grueling wage that must be earned through agonizing labor. Tyson abruptly swallowed his sobs, choking on the bitter metallic taste of his own blood. The icy finality in his father's voice acted as an immediate and sobering slap to the face. Joseph turned away and walked toward a rusted metal locker standing in the far corner of the cramped room. He yanked the heavy door open, retrieving a massive bundle of heavy fabric. He walked back to the cot and threw the bundle directly at Tyson's face. Tyson flinched, catching a heavy, grease-stained pair of insulated canvas coveralls and a pair of scuffed steel-toed work boots. They reeked of industrial diesel salt water and stale sweat. Joseph then pulled a crumpled, yellowed slip of paper from his pocket and flicked it onto the rough towel resting on Tyson's chest. The slip contained a hastily scribbled address. Joseph laid out the absolute non-negotiable terms of his son's survival. He instructed Tyson to put on the coveralls and boots the second he finished his cold soup. The address on the paper was his new and only destination. Joseph stated that Tyson was expected to be on-site, fully geared and ready for backbreaking manual labor at exactly 5 a.m. There would be absolutely no executive transportation, no corporate expense accounts, and zero margin for error. He informed Tyson that he would have to walk through the remaining snowstorm to reach the location before dawn. Joseph issued his final ultimatum with terrifying clarity. If Tyson arrived even a single minute late, or if he complained to anyone about the agonizing physical conditions, he would find the cabin door permanently deadbolted upon his return. Failing this strict assignment meant immediate permanent exile back into the freezing city streets without a single dime to his name. Tyson gingerly picked up the crumpled yellow slip of paper with his bruised, aching fingers. He squinted through his swollen eyes, bringing the scribbled text closer to the dim glow of the pendant light. His heart plummeted directly into his stomach as he recognized the specific street intersection. It was the absolute lowest rung of the entire Apex logistics empire. The address pointed directly to the brutal, freezing commercial shipping docks situated at the very edge of the city's industrial waterfront. It was the exact location where Joseph had spent 30 grueling years breaking his own back loading freight before building his massive fortune. It was an environment of relentless physical punishment, completely devoid of corporate privileges or executive comfort. Tyson realized he was not being offered a desk job or a managerial pathway to redemption. He was being forcibly thrown into the absolute bottom of the labor pool, required to bleed for minimal wage among hardened, unforgiving dock workers who despised corporate elites. He looked up, opening his mouth to negotiate the harsh terms or request a single day to heal his fractured ribs. Joseph did not give him the opportunity to speak. His father reached up and sharply pulled the metal chain of the pendant lamp, instantly plunging the small cabin into deep, suffocating darkness. The only remaining illumination was the dying orange embers in the stone fireplace. Joseph turned his back on his son and walked silently into the adjacent bedroom, shutting the heavy wooden door with a loud, definitive click. Tyson sat completely alone in the freezing shadows, clutching the grease-stained coveralls against his battered chest. He stared at the glowing embers, fully comprehending the terrifying, agonizing reality of the brutal reconstruction awaiting him in the freezing dawn. The digital clock above the rusted steel gates of the commercial shipping docks flashed exactly 4:55 in the morning. Tyson dragged his exhausted body through the chain-link entrance, the oversized, grease-stained coveralls doing little to block the bitter, salt-heavy wind whipping off the black water. The industrial yard was a chaotic maze of towering steel cranes, deafening diesel engines, and blinding floodlights that cast long, harsh shadows across the frozen concrete. He joined a line of hardened, silent men waiting outside a corrugated metal field office. The door swung open, revealing a massive, broad-shouldered foreman with a thick gray beard and a clipboard clutched in his leather-gloved hand. The foreman barked out assignments with a booming, gravelly voice, his eyes scanning the crew before landing squarely on Tyson. He stepped off the metal platform, inspecting Tyson's bruised face and trembling posture with immediate, unfiltered contempt. Joseph had clearly made a phone call. The foreman did not ask for Tyson's name or review any corporate credentials. He pointed a thick, calloused finger toward the farthest, most exposed pier at the edge of the harbor. He ordered Tyson to report immediately to the frozen freight detail, a grueling assignment requiring the manual offloading of heavily iced commercial seafood crates from the bowels of a deep-sea trawler. He handed Tyson a pair of stiff frozen rubber gloves, warning him that the quota was absolute and any slow movement would result in immediate termination. Tyson stared at the massive cargo ship looming against the dark horizon. The freezing ocean spray coated the steel gangway in a treacherous layer of solid ice. He swallowed his rising panic, zipped his heavy canvas coat to his chin, and marched toward the absolute lowest tier of human labor. The sheer physical brutality of the frozen freight detail struck Tyson within the first 20 minutes of the shift. Each wooden crate weighed nearly 80 pounds, coated in a thick, jagged layer of marine ice that tore directly through the cheap rubber gloves. By the second hour, Tyson's back screamed in blinding agony, his previously comfortable muscles completely unequipped for the relentless, repetitive lifting. His hands, soft from a lifetime of tapping keyboards and signing executive memos, rapidly blistered and split open against the freezing wood. Fresh blood seeped into the lining of his gloves, mixing painfully with the freezing salt water. His chest heaved as he struggled to maintain the demanding pace set by the veteran dock workers. The seasoned men moving alongside him operated with a synchronized mechanical efficiency, completely unfazed by the brutal conditions. They quickly noticed Tyson lagging behind, his knees buckling slightly every time a new crate was slammed onto his shoulders. A tall, burly worker covered in salt stains shoved past him on the icy gangway, intentionally clipping Tyson's shoulder. The man openly mocked Tyson's trembling legs and shallow, ragged breathing, loudly asking if the delicate city boy needed a warm blanket and a glass of champagne. The surrounding crew erupted in harsh, cruel laughter, actively isolating the struggling newcomer. They recognized immediately that Tyson did not belong in their world. He was an imposter invading a space reserved for authentic blue-collar grit. The psychological humiliation burned far worse than the freezing wind. Tyson gritted his teeth, tasting the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. He desperately tried to quicken his pace, but his severely bruised ribs flared with a sharp, paralyzing pain, completely overriding his willpower and forcing him to drop to one knee on the frozen steel deck. The piercing wail of the noon whistle echoed across the harbor, signaling a brief, desperately needed reprieve, but the frozen freight detail was strictly ordered to finish the current trawler before breaking. Tyson's vision blurred at the edges as he hoisted another massive ice-coated crate from the lower cargo hold. His forearms shook uncontrollably, the muscles entirely depleted of glycogen and strength. As he stepped onto the treacherous ice-covered metal gangway, his scuffed steel-toed boot slipped on a patch of frozen grease. His grip failed entirely. The 80-pound wooden crate crashed violently onto the steel deck, shattering instantly. Hundreds of pounds of frozen fish spilled across the walkway, halting the entire production line. The foreman stormed down the gangway, his face flushed with pure, unadulterated fury. He stood directly over Tyson, screaming that this dock was a place for men who actually worked for a living, not a playground for weak, pampered failures playing dress-up. He aggressively pointed a thick finger toward the main gate, ordering Tyson to walk away, go back to his luxurious, comfortable corporate life, and stop wasting everyone's valuable time. The foreman's words echoed the absolute worst insecurities buried deep within Tyson's shattered ego. Every muscle in his bruised body begged him to surrender. He looked at the shattered crate, the mocking faces of the veteran crew, and the freezing dark water churning below the pier. He slowly pushed himself up from the icy deck, leaving the scattered cargo untouched. He turned his back on the foreman and began walking slowly toward the chain-link exit. The immense relief of surrender washed over him. He was ready to walk out the gate, accept his permanent exile from his father's life, and fade quietly into the unforgiving streets. Tyson dragged his boots across the cracked concrete, measuring the short distance remaining to the rusted exit gates. The freezing wind pushed against his back, urging him to leave the brutal industrial yard forever. As he neared the security checkpoint, a rhythmic metallic squeaking caught his attention. He turned his head and watched an older, heavily weathered worker pushing a massively overloaded steel supply cart uphill toward a distant warehouse. The man's back was deeply hunched, his worn jacket patched with duct tape and his hands entirely stripped of gloves despite the biting cold. The older man did not complain, did not pause to rest, and did not seek sympathy from the passing crews. He simply leaned his entire body weight into the heavy steel bar, moving forward with a quiet, unbreakable resolve. A sudden, vivid memory struck Tyson like a physical blow. He remembered his father, Joseph, arriving at their cramped apartment 30 years ago, smelling of diesel and salt water. His knuckles bruised and taped, carrying the exact same silent, unyielding dignity. Tyson finally understood that the massive logistics empire was not inherited or stolen. It was built entirely on this exact foundation of grueling, agonizing labor. The realization shattered his lingering desire to quit. The pain in his ribs and the bleeding blisters on his hands suddenly felt like necessary payments rather than punishments. Tyson stopped walking. He stared at the open gate for one final second before turning around completely. He marched back down the frozen pier, pushing past the shocked veteran dock workers. He dropped to his knees on the icy gangway without a single word of complaint, gathered the scattered frozen fish with his bare, bleeding hands, hoisted the broken crate, and brutally finished the agonizing shift. 2,000 miles away from the freezing commercial docks, the blazing desert sun baked the cracked asphalt of a nameless border town. Conrad sat on the edge of a sagging mattress inside a cheap, dust-choked motel room. He clutched a leather duffel bag stuffed with the last remnants of his offshore cash. He had abandoned Tyson Valerie and the entirety of his collapsing Ponzi scheme the moment the federal subpoenas were issued. He genuinely believed he had successfully outmaneuvered the authorities and secured his passage across the southern border. He reached for a glass of lukewarm tap water to wash down his anxiety. Before the rim touched his lips, the flimsy wooden door of the motel room exploded inward. Splinters of cheap pine showered the stained carpet as heavily armored federal agents swarmed the confined space. They moved with overwhelming tactical precision, shouting commands that deafened him. Conrad dropped the glass, his manicured hands trembling violently as he was forcefully slammed face first against the mildewed floral wallpaper. The agents kicked his legs apart and wrenched his arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists, biting painfully into his skin. His expensive silk shirt tore at the shoulder as they dragged him roughly toward the exit. The illusion of his untouchable elite status evaporated into the dry desert air. He was dragged out into the blinding sunlight, paraded past a group of stunned motel guests, and shoved into the back of a reinforced transport vehicle. The federal agents seized the leather duffel bag, officially seizing the last remaining dollars of his fraudulent empire. Conrad stared through the wire mesh of the vehicle window, realizing his grand escape had culminated in absolute ruin. Months later, the glaring lights of a federal courtroom illuminated the absolute destruction of Conrad's fabricated legacy. Valerie sat rigidly on the polished wooden witness stand, her designer wardrobe replaced by a conservative muted gray pantsuit. She looked drastically aged, her posture rigid with a desperate calculating survival instinct. Facing the devastating reality of multiple conspiracy and wire fraud charges, Valerie had swiftly abandoned any lingering loyalty to her former lover. She had aggressively brokered a plea agreement with the federal prosecutors, actively turning state's evidence to save herself from a lengthy prison term. She leaned into the microphone and systematically dismantled Conrad's entire operation. Her voice echoed clearly across the cavernous room as she detailed the precise mechanisms of the fraudulent offshore accounts and the fabricated investment portfolios. She provided the jury with a damning, comprehensive roadmap of how Conrad had expertly manipulated wealthy investors and drained corporate logistics funds, specifically outlining Tyson's pathetic involvement. She spared no one, completely exposing the elaborate smokescreen that had funded their lavish high society lifestyle. Every major news network broadcast the explosive testimony live, broadcasting the spectacular downfall of their counterfeit elite status to millions of viewers. The wealthy socialites who had once attended their extravagant charity galas watched in absolute disgust as the ugly criminal truth was laid bare. Valerie stared directly at Conrad, who sat silently at the defense table in a shapeless prison uniform. He glared back at her with unfiltered, venomous hatred. She did not flinch or look away. She offered up his freedom on a silver platter, meticulously detailing his crimes to ensure she would walk out of the courthouse a free woman. The absolute ruthlessness of her betrayal cemented the final nail in the coffin of their disastrous partnership. The presiding federal judge adjusted his glasses and looked down from the towering mahogany bench, his expression radiating absolute contempt for the defendants. The courtroom fell completely silent as he delivered the final, inescapable verdict. He addressed Conrad first, tearing into the profound arrogance and extreme financial devastation caused by the sprawling Ponzi scheme. The judge stated that white-collar criminals who destroy lives and decimate savings accounts deserve no leniency. He struck his heavy wooden gavel and officially sentenced Conrad to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely devoid of any possibility for early parole. Conrad slumped back in his chair, the crushing weight of a decade and a half behind bars instantly draining the remaining color from his face. The judge then turned his piercing gaze toward Valerie. He acknowledged her extensive cooperation with the federal prosecutors, confirming that her testimony was instrumental in securing the primary conviction. Because of the plea agreement, he granted her a fully suspended sentence, ensuring she would avoid a physical prison cell. However, the judge immediately dropped a crippling financial anvil on her future. He issued a massive non-negotiable restitution order. He commanded that every single dollar she had stolen, spent, or benefited from during the fraudulent enterprise must be repaid in full to the victims. The court officially seized her luxury vehicles, froze all her personal bank accounts, and liquidated her remaining jewelry collection. She was legally stripped of absolutely everything she owned, leaving her with an insurmountable mountain of federal debt. Valerie walked out of the courthouse physically free, but completely impoverished. She was permanently shackled to a massive financial burden, ensuring that the remainder of her natural life would be spent paying for the extreme greed she had so proudly displayed. The sharp descent from high society luxury into absolute poverty was instantaneous and deeply traumatic. Valerie dragged her only remaining suitcase up 3 flights of dimly lit concrete stairs. She pushed open the warped door of a cramped, roach-infested studio apartment located in the worst industrial sector of the city. The stale air smelled strongly of mold and cheap cooking oil. Peeling linoleum lined the uneven floor, and the singular dirty window looked out over a sprawling alleyway filled with overflowing dumpsters. She sat heavily on the stained, sagging mattress, her manicured hands trembling as she surveyed her grim new reality. The silence of the tiny room pressed down on her, a stark and terrifying contrast to the sprawling mansions she used to command. She had absolutely no friends left to call, no social standing to leverage, and zero prospects for legitimate employment. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she possessed less than $20 to her name. Desperation, cold and absolute, finally overpowered her immense pride. She reached into her cheap canvas bag and pulled out a prepaid burner phone she had purchased with her last few crumpled bills. She stared at the blank screen, her mind racing through her completely depleted list of options. There was only one man left in the world who had ever offered her genuine stability, unyielding support, and unconditional love. She slowly punched in the familiar 10-digit number she had intentionally memorized decades ago. She pressed the call button and raised the cheap plastic device to her ear. She listened to the dial tone echo in the small, squalid room, silently praying that Joseph would pick up the phone and allow her to manipulate her way back into his deeply forgiving heart. The harsh ring of the landline cut through the quiet solitude of Joseph's wood-paneled study. He sat in his worn leather armchair, the warm glow of a brass desk lamp casting long shadows across the stack of logistics manifests he had been reviewing. He stared at the glowing caller ID on his old battered cellular device resting on the mahogany desk. It was an unsaved number, but decades of finely tuned intuition told him exactly who was on the other end of the line. Joseph picked up the receiver and brought it to his ear without offering a single word of greeting. A frantic, trembling voice spilled out from the tiny speaker. Valerie sounded entirely broken, her previously polished society cadence replaced by breathless, ragged desperation. She wept openly, describing the squalor of her cramped, roach-infested studio apartment and the terrifying reality of her complete financial ruin. She begged Joseph for a temporary loan, just enough cash to cover her first month of rent and buy basic groceries until she could secure a minimum wage job. She swore she had profoundly changed, claiming the absolute destruction of Conrad's criminal empire had finally opened her eyes to the devastating consequences of her immense greed. She desperately reminded Joseph of their shared past, pleading with him to remember the early years they spent together before ambition poisoned her mind. She cried out that she had absolutely no one else in the world to turn to, insisting that a man as fundamentally decent as Joseph could not possibly leave the mother of his only son to starve in the gutters of the industrial district. Joseph listened to her pathetic, manic monologue with a completely impassive, stone-cold expression, absorbing every desperate syllable without a single flinch. Joseph allowed a long, heavy silence to hang on the line after her frantic pleas subsided into pathetic whimpering. He finally spoke, his voice carrying the deep, unyielding resonance of a man who had entirely purged his soul of false sentimentality. He informed Valerie with absolute surgical clarity that her current suffering was not a tragic accident, but the precise calculated mathematics of her own arrogant decisions. He reminded her that she had willingly and enthusiastically traded decades of steadfast loyalty for the glittering, hollow illusion of a fraudster's stolen gold. She had actively participated in a massive criminal conspiracy, reveling in unearned luxury while openly mocking the honest, grueling labor that built genuine wealth. Joseph stated firmly that her sudden revelation of regret was nothing more than a panicked survival tactic from a cornered predator caught in a trap of her own making. He coldly dismantled her desperate attempt to weaponize their shared history, declaring that the woman he once loved had died the exact moment she aligned herself with Conrad's parasitic empire. He explained that protecting his own mental peace and safeguarding his hard-earned corporate legacy required the ruthless permanent extraction of toxic elements regardless of how much time they had spent together. He told her that a malignant tumor cannot be negotiated with, reasoned with, or rehabilitated. It must simply be cut out and completely discarded to preserve the health of the host. Joseph made it explicitly, undeniably clear that he would not provide a single penny to alleviate her misery. He told her she was finally experiencing the genuine, unfiltered reality of the world she had so eagerly manipulated and that she would have to survive it entirely on her own. Valerie gasped on the other end of the line, completely stunned by the impenetrable wall of his rejection. She frantically tried to speak again, launching into another hysterical, tearful justification of her crimes, desperate to keep the connection alive. Joseph did not allow her to finish the desperate sentence. He simply moved his thumb and pressed the red button, cutting the connection with a sharp, definitive digital click. He sat in the profound silence of his study, feeling absolutely no remorse for the brutal finality of his action. He picked up the battered cellular device, staring at the worn plastic casing that had tethered him to his painful past for far too long. With swift, deliberate movements, he popped the back cover off the old phone and violently ripped the rectangular battery from its housing. He walked across the room and dropped the dead battery directly into the metal trash can beside his desk, following it immediately with the cracked plastic casing and the useless SIM card. The physical destruction of the device represented the absolute eradication of his former vulnerabilities. He walked over to a secure combination safe tucked discreetly behind a heavy oak bookshelf. He spun the metal dial, opened the heavy door, and retrieved a pristine, encrypted smartphone provided by Attorney Hayes just hours prior. Joseph powered on the sleek new device, watching the corporate logo illuminate the dark screen. The new phone contained only the highly secure contacts necessary to govern the apex of his logistics empire. Every toxic connection, every treacherous family tie, and every manipulative whisper from his past was now legally, technologically, and emotionally obliterated. He was finally entirely unburdened, standing at the absolute pinnacle of his hard-won kingdom with a completely clean slate. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the early morning hours, signaling the start of a grueling new day. Joseph turned away from his mahogany desk and walked heavily toward the small mudroom at the back of the cabin. He bypassed his polished dress shoes and reached for a heavily scuffed, deeply creased pair of steel-toed work boots. He laced them up tightly, his calloused fingers pulling the thick leather strings with practiced, unyielding force. The familiar weight of the boots grounded him instantly, a powerful reminder of the relentless physical labor that had forged his unbreakable foundation. He grabbed his worn canvas jacket, stepped out into the freezing pre-dawn air, and climbed into the driver's seat of his rusty, reliable pickup truck. The engine roared to life with a familiar mechanical growl cutting through the biting winter wind. Joseph steered the heavy vehicle down the winding mountain road, leaving the quiet sanctuary of the woods behind as he navigated toward the sprawling industrial waterfront. It was time to physically inspect the lowest tier of his massive operational investment. The towering steel cranes and blazing floodlights of the commercial shipping docks soon appeared against the dark, frozen horizon. Joseph parked his truck discreetly behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, stepping out into the brutal, salt-heavy wind. He zipped his canvas coat to his chin and walked silently toward the edge of the frozen pier. He stood perfectly still in the deep shadows, his sharp eyes scanning the exhausted crew of dock workers manually offloading iced cargo crates. It was time to quietly and ruthlessly evaluate the broken son who was currently bleeding in the mud, fighting desperately to rebuild his soul from the absolute bottom of the empire. The freezing wind finally began to die down as the Friday shift came to a brutal, exhausting close. Tyson stood in the long, silent line of laborers outside the corrugated metal field office, his entire body radiating a dull, heavy ache. His steel-toed boots felt like concrete blocks, and the thick canvas coveralls were permanently stained with saltwater grease and the blood from his own blistered hands. When he finally reached the front of the line, the massive foreman did not offer a word of praise or a friendly nod. He simply shoved a thin manila envelope through the grated window. Tyson took the envelope with trembling, calloused fingers. He stepped out of the way, moving under the harsh glare of a halogen floodlight to inspect his wages. He tore the top open and pulled out a small stack of worn, crumpled bills. It was a pathetic, almost insulting sum compared to the massive corporate bonuses he used to authorize with a single stroke of a pen. The cash in his hand was barely enough to cover a decent steak dinner in his former life. Yet as he stared at the soiled currency, a completely unfamiliar sensation blossomed inside his battered chest. He felt a profound, undeniable surge of genuine pride. Every single dollar in that envelope represented agonizing physical pain, sheer willpower, and survival. He had not stolen this money. He had not manipulated a spreadsheet or defrauded an investor to acquire it. He had bled for it in the freezing mud of the commercial shipping docks. He carefully folded the bills and tucked them deep into the inner pocket of his heavy coat, treating the meager sum with far more reverence than he had ever shown his offshore bank accounts. The industrial waterfront emptied quickly as the exhausted dock workers dispersed toward the distant bus stops and rusted parking lots. Tyson walked alone, navigating the dark, poorly lit streets bordering the shipping yards. The freezing temperature plummeted further, turning the puddles on the cracked asphalt into slick patches of black ice. He kept his head down, eager to reach the transit station and find a moment of warmth. As he passed a narrow, trash-filled alleyway cutting between two abandoned warehouses, the shadows shifted. Two men stepped out from the darkness, effectively blocking his path to the main road. They were young, desperate, and armed with heavy steel pipes. The taller of the two stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the bulge of the envelope hidden inside Tyson's canvas jacket. He demanded the cash immediately, threatening to break Tyson's kneecaps if he resisted. A month ago, the old Tyson would have surrendered instantly. The arrogant logistics executive would have practically thrown his designer wallet at the attackers, terrified of physical confrontation and entirely willing to buy his way out of danger. But the man standing in the freezing alleyway was no longer that cowardly corporate fraud. He felt the cold, hard weight of the steel-toed boots on his feet and remembered the agonizing week he had just endured. Giving up this money meant surrendering his absolute first ounce of reclaimed dignity. It meant letting parasites steal the blood he had left on the icy deck of the trawler. Tyson squared his aching shoulders, planting his boots firmly on the frozen pavement. He looked the muggers directly in the eyes, his voice low and completely devoid of fear. He stated with absolute terrifying calm that they would have to kill him to take a single dollar. The taller thug swung the steel pipe without another word of warning, aiming a vicious blow directly at Tyson's head. Tyson ducked instinctively, the heavy weapon clipping his shoulder with a sickening thud that sent a shockwave of pain down his spine. The impact would have shattered his resolve a month ago, but the grueling labor at the docks had transformed his soft muscles into dense reactive cord. He lunged forward, driving his heavy work boots squarely into the attacker's knee. The man howled, his leg buckling under the immense force. The second mugger rushed in from the side, tackling Tyson to the freezing asphalt. The two men grappled in the dirty snow, a chaotic tangle of desperate violence. The mugger managed to tear Tyson's coat open, his greedy fingers clawing frantically at the inner pocket. The man yanked a handful of the crumpled bills free, tearing the envelope in half. Tyson roared, a primal, guttural sound echoing off the brick walls. He twisted his battered body, driving a brutal elbow directly into the second attacker's jaw. The sudden explosive strike shattered the man's teeth, forcing him to drop the remaining cash. The first thug, limping heavily, grabbed his bleeding accomplice by the collar and dragged him backward into the darkness of the alley. They fled, taking a small portion of the wages, but leaving the rest scattered on the ground. Tyson stayed on his hands and knees, gasping for breath. A deep gash above his eyebrow poured fresh, warm blood down the side of his face. He ignored the stinging pain, meticulously gathering the remaining blood-stained bills from the icy pavement. He had lost half his wages, but he had successfully defended his absolute right to exist. Tyson walked the remaining 2 miles to a dilapidated 24-hour diner situated on the very edge of the industrial district. He pushed through the glass doors, ignoring the alarmed stares of the late-night patrons assessing his bruised, bleeding face. He walked straight to the counter and placed a portion of his hard-earned crumpled bills onto the formica surface. He purchased 2 large containers of hot, hearty beef stew, a loaf of fresh bread, and a thermos of black coffee. He did not eat the food. He packed the containers securely into a brown paper bag and marched back out into the freezing night. His destination was the dense pine forest and the winding dirt road leading to his father's cabin. The brutal 10-mile trek was agonizing, but his physical endurance had radically shifted since his first pathetic arrival. He navigated the dark, snow-covered highway with a steady, unbroken rhythm. When he finally reached the clearing, the familiar timber cabin stood silent against the winter storm. Tyson did not stumble, and he did not approach the heavy oak door seeking shelter or validation. He walked quietly onto the wooden porch. He placed the warm bag of food carefully on the welcome mat. He pulled a torn piece of cardboard from his pocket, wrote 2 simple words in dark ink, and laid the note on top of the bread. It simply read, "Thank you." Tyson turned his back on the warm, inviting cabin and walked back out into the freezing blizzard, heading toward the city streets. Inside the darkened study, Joseph stood perfectly still by the front window. He watched his son vanish into the trees, finally recognizing the faint, undeniable spark of a genuine man rising from the ashes of his destruction. The brutal, freezing weeks bled into a grueling routine that systematically dismantled the last vestiges of Tyson's former fragility. He surrendered entirely to the unforgiving rhythm of the shipping docks. His blistered hands gradually healed into thick, unyielding calluses, and his previously soft posture straightened under the relentless weight of the frozen cargo crates. The veteran dock workers who had initially mocked his weakness slowly began to acknowledge his silent endurance. He no longer dropped his burdens or complained about the biting coastal wind. He arrived before dawn, worked straight through the freezing rain, and earned his wages with pure, unadulterated sweat. The physical transformation mirrored a profound mental reconstruction. The toxic arrogance that had defined his corporate existence evaporated, replaced by the quiet, heavy dignity of honest labor. As the piercing whistle blew to signal the end of a punishing Friday shift, Tyson wiped the freezing salt water from his brow and walked toward the chain-link exit. The yard was filled with the usual exhaust fumes and the loud chatter of exhausted men. Through the dense fog of the industrial lot, a jarring splash of misplaced luxury caught his eye. Megan stood perfectly poised near the rusted turnstile, shivering in a tailored crimson trench coat and designer heels that sank into the muddy gravel. Her sudden appearance in the heart of the blue-collar shipyard was violently out of place. Tyson stopped in his tracks, staring at the woman who had brutally discarded him in a luxury penthouse just months ago. She clutched a glossy leather handbag, her perfectly manicured fingers nervously playing with the strap. Megan had clearly utilized her vast network of high society informants and public records to trace his whereabouts. She had uncovered the fiercely guarded secret that Joseph entirely owned the massive port facility. Megan spotted Tyson through the crowd of exiting laborers and immediately rushed forward, her heels slipping on the icy concrete. She launched into a carefully rehearsed performance, allowing large theatrical tears to spill over her pristine makeup. She reached out, attempting to grasp his grease-stained canvas jacket with trembling hands. She vehemently apologized for her hasty departure and the brutal divorce proceedings, claiming she had been blinded by a momentary lapse in judgment. She spun a frantic narrative of regret, insisting that she had realized her terrible mistake the second she walked out of his life. Tyson stood completely motionless, feeling absolutely nothing as her crocodile tears stained her expensive coat. Sensing his lack of immediate response, Megan shifted her strategy from emotional manipulation to calculated greed. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, glancing nervously at the passing dock workers. She revealed her discovery regarding Joseph's vast hidden logistics empire. She proposed a highly detailed, insidious plan to team up and subtly siphon staggering amounts of cash directly from the port's operating budget. She pitched a flawless scheme of fabricated invoices and offshore diversions, promising they could easily bypass his father's antiquated accounting methods. Her eyes lit up with a feverish predatory hunger as she painted a vivid picture of their glorious return to the elite corporate echelon. She offered Tyson his luxurious old life back on a silver platter, assuring him they could reclaim their penthouse, their bespoke wardrobes, and their untouchable social status. She promised to stand by his side, framing their potential theft as a justified reclamation of the wealth he inherently deserved. The intoxicating illusion of effortless money and superficial power hung heavily in the freezing industrial air, completely ignoring the painful transformation Tyson had just endured. Tyson looked down at the woman standing in the freezing mud, experiencing a profound wave of visceral disgust. He did not see the glamorous high society wife he had once desperately tried to impress. He saw exactly what his father had seen weeks ago inside the opulent French restaurant. He saw an empty, calculating parasite who measured human value entirely in dollar signs and stolen comforts. The blistering labor of the past month had completely burned away his desperate need for her toxic validation. He remembered the heavy 80-pound crates of frozen fish, the bleeding blisters on his palms, and the meager envelope of crumpled cash he had fought thugs in a dark alley to protect. That crumpled envelope held infinitely more value and dignity than the millions of dollars Megan was currently plotting to steal. Tyson stepped back, physically removing himself from her grasping, manicured hands. He spoke with a cold, absolute clarity that mirrored his father's immovable authority. He told Megan that his previous existence had been nothing more than a pathetic, fabricated lie built on borrowed money and unearned arrogance. He methodically dismantled her illusion, stating that he was no longer the spineless executive she could effortlessly manipulate into committing fraud. He looked directly into her shocked, widened eyes and called her a parasite incapable of surviving without draining the lifeblood of someone else's hard work. He firmly rejected her fraudulent partnership and her hollow apologies. He made it undeniably clear that the grueling, freezing mud of the shipping docks was worth vastly more than a lifetime spent drowning in her shallow, greedy deceit. The final threads of his old, pathetic life severed completely, freeing him from the suffocating weight of her toxic influence forever. Megan's expression instantly twisted from feigned affection into pure, unadulterated rage. The careful mask of the repentant wife shattered, revealing the vicious, cornered opportunist hiding underneath. She began screaming frantically, hurling vicious insults and promising to entirely ruin whatever pathetic reputation he had left. Tyson did not flinch, and he did not turn back to engage in her hysterical outburst. He simply adjusted the collar of his grease-stained canvas coat and walked steadily past her, merging into the stream of exhausted laborers, heading toward the city buses. He left her standing entirely alone in the freezing, muddy parking lot, her desperate screams entirely drowned out by the roaring diesel engines of the passing freight trucks. High above the chaotic dirt lot behind the tinted glass of the elevated Port Authority office, Joseph stood perfectly still. He lowered the heavy set of brass binoculars from his eyes, having watched the entire interaction unfold in the freezing yard below. He had witnessed his son's immediate, unwavering rejection of the very temptation that had previously defined his entire existence. Joseph walked slowly toward his heavy mahogany desk, his weathered face reflecting a profound, quiet satisfaction. The boy who had wept on the cabin floor demanding unearned forgiveness had officially died, replaced by a man capable of defending his own honor against his deepest weaknesses. Joseph picked up the encrypted smartphone resting next to a stack of shipping manifests. He dialed the direct secure line to his private attorney. The call connected instantly. Joseph spoke with absolute unwavering conviction, his voice cutting through the quiet office. He instructed Attorney Hayes to finalize the legal documents and prepare the corporate board. The grueling period of breaking the boy was officially over. The final test of the man was ready. The relentless physical conditioning of the past few months had forged Tyson into a hardened, uncompromising leader on the freezing docks. His unwavering dedication and silent endurance eventually earned him a sudden, unceremonious promotion to dock supervisor. He no longer hauled the frozen crates himself, but orchestrated the chaotic movements of the heavy machinery and the veteran crews with a calm, methodical precision. The true measure of his new authority was immediately challenged by a catastrophic winter gale that battered the coastal facility with blinding rain and gale-force winds. The yard transformed into a treacherous expanse of deep mud and flying debris. In the midst of the howling storm, a massive cargo container designated for urgent priority transfer was critically mishandled. The container held millions of dollars in fragile, temperature-sensitive medical supplies destined for a regional hospital network. A cascading scheduling error had left the container exposed on the unprotected loading ramp for hours, completely vulnerable to the freezing deluge. The heavy steel doors buckled under the wind, and the protective thermal seals were utterly compromised by the driving ice. Tyson frantically coordinated an emergency recovery team wading through knee-deep freezing water to manually secure the damaged pallets. He dragged the heavy medical crates into the dry warehouse, his muscles burning as he fought against the relentless weather. Despite his desperate freezing labor, the damage was extensive and undeniable. He stood dripping wet on the concrete floor, staring at the ruined, waterlogged inventory. The scheduling manifest clearly showed a fatal discrepancy in the arrival times, an administrative disaster that fell entirely under his direct supervision. He did not know that this specific, devastating logistical failure had been deliberately and secretly engineered by Attorney Hayes at Joseph's strict command. The storm had barely subsided when a sleek armored town car tore through the industrial gates and slammed to a halt directly inside the warehouse loading bay. Attorney Hayes stepped out of the pristine vehicle, his immaculate charcoal suit forming a sharp, violent contrast to the mud and destruction surrounding him. He did not introduce himself as Joseph's personal counsel. Instead, he aggressively assumed the role of the furious, uncompromising corporate client who owned the ruined medical freight. Hayes marched across the wet concrete floor, his expensive leather shoes echoing sharply over the hum of the diesel generators. He stared at the waterlogged pallets and immediately unleashed a torrent of calculated, absolute fury. He cornered the dock manager and screamed that the catastrophic negligence displayed by this facility would bankrupt the entire port. He threatened a massive, unyielding lawsuit that would instantly liquidate the warehouse and freeze every operational asset within 24 hours. Hayes paced violently in front of the assembled, exhausted dock workers, projecting the exact kind of merciless corporate arrogance that Tyson used to wield so effortlessly in his past life. He demanded total retribution for the millions of dollars lost in the freezing rain. He locked his cold, analytical gaze onto the management team and demanded the immediate public termination of the specific supervisor responsible for the loading ramp. He roared that someone must hang for this incompetence, insisting that a simple apology would never cover the sheer magnitude of the financial destruction. The veteran dock workers nervously shifted their weight, glancing sideways at Tyson. The crushing pressure of the corporate world had violently invaded the blue-collar sanctuary, demanding a human sacrifice to appease the bottom line. A suffocating silence fell over the freezing warehouse as the absolute weight of the attorney's threat settled onto the crew. In his previous life, Tyson would have immediately sought a scapegoat. He would have aggressively blamed the volatile weather, the incompetence of the forklift operators, or the faulty thermal seals on the shipping containers. He would have fabricated an elaborate excuse to protect his own position and sacrifice anyone standing beneath him without a second thought. But the man standing in the soaking, mud-stained coveralls did not retreat into the shadows. Tyson stepped forward, separating himself entirely from the line of exhausted workers. He walked directly up to the enraged attorney, planting his steel-toed boots firmly on the wet concrete. He looked Hayes squarely in the eyes and stated with quiet, unbreakable resolve that he was the dock supervisor. Tyson did not offer a single defensive excuse. He explicitly stated that the scheduling failure occurred under his watch, making the destruction of the medical supplies his sole, undeniable responsibility. He refused to let the hard-working men behind him lose their jobs or face financial ruin for a mistake he was paid to prevent. He absorbed the full, terrifying brunt of the corporate fury without flinching. Tyson then offered a brutal, uncompromising solution. He stated that he could not write a check to cover the massive financial loss, but he possessed an abundance of physical labor. He offered to work entirely unpaid, taking on double shifts and weekend details for the next 6 consecutive months. He pledged every ounce of his sweat and blood to cover the insurance deductible, firmly demanding that the rest of the crew remain employed and completely untouched by the fallout. The aggressive, manufactured rage instantly drained from Attorney Hayes's face. The harsh lines of his theatrical performance vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, calculating assessment. He stared at the soaking, bruised man standing before him, recognizing the sheer magnitude of the transformation. Hayes did not deliver another screaming insult or threaten a devastating legal injunction. He simply nodded his head slowly, a silent acknowledgement of an absolute victory. The veteran attorney turned his back on the ruined medical supplies, calmly walking over to his pristine leather briefcase resting on a dry steel barrel. He snapped the golden latches open with a sharp click, completely ignoring the bewildered stares of the surrounding dock workers. He reached inside and retrieved a thick, heavy black envelope sealed with a familiar crimson wax crest. Hayes walked back to Tyson and pressed the heavy envelope directly into his bruised, calloused hands. He spoke in a quiet, measured tone that carried absolutely no malice. He informed Tyson that the damages would be handled internally and that his grueling tenure on the freezing shipping docks was permanently concluded. He instructed Tyson to go back to his father's cabin, wash the grease from his skin, and put on a tailored suit. Hayes delivered his final, monumental directive with absolute precision. He commanded Tyson to report directly to the top floor of the Apex Logistics corporate headquarters at exactly 8 in the morning the following Monday. He stated that the chairman of the board was finally ready to discuss the future of the empire. Hayes turned and walked back to his idling town car, leaving Tyson standing in the freezing warehouse, gripping the black envelope that represented his ultimate, agonizingly earned resurrection. Tyson stood before the towering glass facade of the Apex Logistics headquarters. Exactly 1 year had passed since he was violently ejected from this very building, stripped of his fraudulent title and corporate vanity. He did not wear bespoke Italian silk today. He wore a stiff, inexpensive, off-the-rack suit purchased with the crumpled bills he had bled for on the freezing docks. The cheap fabric chafed against his broad, newly heavily muscled shoulders. He walked through the revolving glass doors with a measured, grounded stride, entirely ignoring the perplexed stares of the junior executives who recognized the ghost of their former superior. He bypassed the polished VYP elevator bank, opting for the standard staff lift to reach the top floor. He clutched the heavy black envelope in his right hand, his thick, scarred calluses gripping the paper like a lifeline. The elevator doors parted with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling expanse of the executive suite. He navigated the plush carpeted hallway, stopping in front of the massive double doors of the primary boardroom. He pushed them open without a single moment of hesitation. The room was vast, sterile, and freezing cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. Joseph sat perfectly still at the absolute head of the long mahogany table. He wore his standard flannel shirt and worn denim jeans, utterly defying the corporate opulence surrounding him. Attorney Hayes stood silently in the corner, his hands folded neatly behind his back. Joseph did not stand to greet his son. He did not offer a warm smile or a theatrical gesture of welcome. He simply pointed a thick, work-worn finger at the single empty leather chair positioned directly across from him at the opposite end of the table. Tyson crossed the expansive boardroom and sat down in the leather chair, keeping his posture rigid and entirely attentive. The oppressive silence stretched between them, thick with the heavy weight of the brutal year that had completely shattered their previous relationship. Joseph maintained his steely, impenetrable gaze, meticulously examining the physical and psychological alterations in the man sitting across from him. He noted the faded scars on Tyson's jaw, the hardened set of his shoulders, and the quiet, unyielding respect burning in his eyes. Joseph finally reached into a plain manila folder resting on the table. He produced a single stapled legal document and slid it forcefully across the polished mahogany. The thick packet stopped directly in front of Tyson. Joseph spoke with the same sharp, immovable authority he commanded on the shipping docks. He explicitly stated that there would be absolutely no grand emotional reunions, no inherited forgiveness, and zero return to the parasitic luxury of the past. He instructed Tyson to read the document carefully before speaking a single word. Tyson opened the cover page. His eyes scanned the bold legal text detailing his exact corporate standing. It was not a reinstatement of his executive vice president title. It was not a key to a corner office or a blank check for an unlimited expense account. It was a standard binding contract for a mid-level regional logistics manager. The position came with a strictly enforced 6-month probationary period, grueling operational hours, and a highly modest baseline salary completely devoid of executive bonuses. The contract explicitly stripped away every ounce of unearned privilege, offering nothing but an opportunity to build a career entirely from the ground up. Tyson read every single clause, penalty, and restriction printed on the crisp white paper. He absorbed the absolute severity of the probationary terms and the meager financial compensation. A year ago, he would have violently hurled the document across the room, deeply insulted by the perceived lack of respect for his elevated status. Today, he felt a profound, overwhelming sense of grounding relief. The contract was not an insult. It was a genuine, authentic foundation. It was the exact blueprint of a life built on merit rather than manipulation. Tyson did not attempt to negotiate the salary or argue for a superior operational title. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a cheap plastic pen. He flipped directly to the final signature page, pressed the pen against the paper, and signed his name with a firm, decisive stroke. He closed the folder and pushed it back across the mahogany table toward his father. Tyson looked directly into Joseph's eyes, his voice steady and completely stripped of his former arrogance. He stated clearly that the offer was immensely generous, acknowledging openly that it was far more than he actually deserved after his previous betrayals. He thanked his father for the opportunity to work. Joseph stared at the signed document, tracing the blue ink with his calloused thumb. The rigid, unforgiving lines of his weathered face finally softened. The towering patriarch leaned back in his chair and allowed a small, incredibly rare smile to break through his stoic facade. The grueling, brutal reconstruction of his only son was entirely complete. The massive, festering tumor of corporate greed had been successfully excised, leaving behind a man finally capable of carrying the true weight of the family legacy. Father and son stood up from the heavy mahogany table simultaneously. They exited the freezing corporate boardroom, leaving Attorney Hayes to file the newly signed employment contract. They rode the elevator down to the ground floor in complete, comfortable silence, entirely unified by the unspoken understanding of the grueling journey they had just survived. They walked out of the towering glass headquarters, stepping into the crisp, fading afternoon light. They did not hail a luxury town car or direct a chauffeur toward an opulent French restaurant. They walked 3 blocks down a side street, pushing through the swinging glass doors of a faded, brightly lit local diner. They sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, ordering 2 simple cheeseburgers and black coffee from a tired waitress. They ate their food without feeling the need to fill the air with hollow conversation or grand declarations of the future. The simple, honest meal tasted vastly superior to any heavily garnished delicacy they had ever shared in their past lives. When the plates were empty, Tyson paid the meager bill using the crumpled cash he had bled for on the freezing shipping docks. They walked back out into the cool evening air, stopping beside Joseph's battered vehicle. Tyson offered a firm, calloused handshake, which Joseph accepted with a powerful, solid grip. Tyson turned and walked toward the nearest bus stop to prepare for his early morning managerial shift. Joseph climbed into the driver's seat of his rusty, reliable pickup truck. He turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life with a steady mechanical growl. He drove away from the glittering city skyline, heading back toward the quiet isolation of his timber cabin. The brutal adjustment was over. The empire was finally secure. The journey of Tyson from an arrogant, entitled executive to a grounded, honorable man offers a profound lesson regarding the true nature of wealth, legacy, and human value. Society frequently measures success entirely through the shallow metrics of material possessions, elevated corporate titles, and public prestige. However, as this narrative violently demonstrates, unearned privilege functions as a highly destructive parasite that systematically devours character. When individuals are handed immense power without experiencing the grueling sacrifice required to build it, they inevitably lose all respect for the labor that sustains their comfort. Tyson initially viewed his father as an outdated fool, entirely misjudging Joseph's quiet humility as a weakness to be exploited. He believed that manipulation and deceit were the hallmarks of modern success. The absolute stripping of his wealth forced him into a brutal collision with unfiltered reality. True transformation cannot occur through soft words or gentle reprimands. It requires a complete dismantling of the false ego. By condemning his son to the freezing mud of the shipping docks, Joseph provided the most agonizing but necessary gift possible: the opportunity to bleed. Physical labor strips away all delusions of grandeur. It teaches accountability in its rawest form. When Tyson received his first meager envelope of honest cash, he discovered a profound pride that millions of stolen dollars could never replicate. He learned that genuine respect is forged in the trenches, not demanded from a leather chair. Furthermore, the story illustrates the critical importance of establishing absolute boundaries against toxic relationships. Both Joseph and Tyson ultimately recognized that parasitic elements, whether they are fraudulent business partners or manipulative spouses, must be ruthlessly excised to preserve one's sanity and legacy. Real love does not blindly finance destructive behavior. It demands total accountability. Ultimately, a secure legacy is never inherited through a bank transfer or a simple signature. It must be earned through sweat, failure, and redemption. The ultimate victory is not acquiring an empire, but proving worthy of holding its absolute weight. The conclusion beautifully emphasizes that real success does not require constant public validation or extravagant displays of wealth. True satisfaction is often found in the quiet, unglamorous moments of life, such as eating a simple meal in a local diner after surviving a monumental struggle. Joseph never needed the corner office or the luxury vehicles to validate his existence, and by the end of his journey, Tyson finally understands this powerful reality. He no longer seeks out hollow status symbols to mask his internal insecurities. Instead, he completely embraces the heavy burden of honest responsibility, choosing a difficult path built entirely upon genuine substance rather than fleeting illusions. This painful restoration process permanently secures the family foundation, ensuring that the corporate empire remains firmly anchored in reality. The story serves as an unforgettable reminder that sometimes breaking a man entirely is the absolute only way to properly rebuild his soul, creating an unbreakable bond forged entirely in the powerful fires of uncompromising truth and unwavering personal sacrifice against tremendous adversity.